Ethan Brooks stared at the eviction notice in his trembling hands while rain hammered against the windshield of his 15-year-old sedan. Just 12 hours ago, he'd had a job, an apartment, and the ability to look his 7-year-old daughter in the eye and promise her everything would be okay. Now he had nothing but the clothes on their backs and a child who trusted him completely. A trust he was terrified he could no longer honor. What Ethan didn't know was that his firing wasn't about performance. It was about silence. And 300 miles away, a billionaire CEO was about to discover she'd destroyed an innocent man's life. If you're watching from anywhere in the world, drop a comment with your city below. I'd love to see how far this story travels. And if you're invested in Ethan's journey already, hit that like button. Trust me, you'll want to see where this goes. The fluorescent lights in the 14th floor conference room had always given Ethan headaches, but today they felt particularly merciless. He sat in the rigid plastic chair, his worn leather portfolio resting on his lap, watching Marcus Hendricks, the regional director who'd once praised Ethan's unparalleled dedication, avoid eye contact while shuffling papers that probably had nothing to do with this meeting. "I'm going to be direct, Ethan," Marcus finally said, though his tone suggested he'd rather be anywhere else. "We're making some organizational changes. Your position is being eliminated effective immediately." The words landed like physical blows. Ethan felt his chest tighten, his carefully maintained composure cracking at the edges. "Eliminated? Marcus, I've been here 9 years. My last 3 performance reviews were exemplary. The distribution efficiency project I designed saved the company nearly $2 million last quarter alone. These decisions come from above my pay grade." Marcus slid a manila envelope across the cheap conference table. "Your severance package, 2 weeks' pay, continuation of benefits for 30 days, and—" "2 weeks?" Ethan's voice cracked despite his best efforts. "I have a daughter, Marcus. I have rent due in 6 days. 2 weeks doesn't even cover—" "The decision is final." Marcus stood abruptly, buttoning his jacket with hands that trembled slightly. For a moment, something resembling guilt flickered across his face. "Security will escort you to collect your personal items." "I'm sorry, Ethan. I really am." But sorry didn't pay rent. Sorry didn't explain to a 7-year-old why Daddy's promises about stability and security had turned to ash. Ethan walked through the office in a daze, a young security guard named Rodriguez trailing 3 steps behind like he was some kind of threat. Colleagues he'd worked alongside for years suddenly became fascinated with their computer screens. Janet from accounting, who'd relied on Ethan's help navigating the new inventory system just last week, pretended to be deeply engrossed in a phone call. Tom Chen, who'd invited Ethan to his wedding, discovered an urgent need to visit the restroom. Only Sarah Matthews, the night shift supervisor, met his eyes. She was standing by the elevators, her usually cheerful face drawn with concern. As Ethan approached with his pathetic cardboard box of desk photos and coffee-stained notebooks, she stepped forward. "This is wrong," she said quietly, ignoring Rodriguez's disapproving frown. "You were the most honest person in this entire building." Apparently that wasn't enough, Ethan managed. Sarah glanced at the security guard, then lowered her voice further. "Those shipping manifests you flagged last month, the ones that didn't match the inventory reports? What about them? They disappeared from the system, completely wiped. And 3 days later, you're fired." Her eyes held a warning. "Be careful, Ethan. I think you saw something you weren't supposed to." Before he could respond, Rodriguez cleared his throat meaningfully. Sarah squeezed Ethan's arm once, then stepped back into the elevator, her expression troubled. The ride down 14 floors had never felt longer. The apartment looked different in the harsh afternoon light, smaller, shabbier, temporary in a way it hadn't felt when Ethan had signed the lease 3 years ago. He stood in the doorway, the eviction notice clutched in his hand, trying to reconcile the bureaucratic language with the reality it represented. Failure to pay rent within 72 hours will result in immediate eviction proceedings. The envelope had been taped to the door, visible to every neighbor who walked past. Mrs. Chen from 3B had definitely seen it. Ethan had caught her hastily averting her eyes when he'd arrived. Nothing spreads faster in an apartment building than the scent of someone else's misfortune. Ethan's phone buzzed. The bank. He let it go to voicemail, already knowing what automated message awaited him. Insufficient funds. His checking account balance, once maintained with obsessive care, now sat at $63.18. The severance check wouldn't be processed for another week, and even then, it wouldn't be enough. He did the math for the 100th time that hour. Rent, $1,050, already 5 days late. Ava's after-school program, $320. Utilities, $187. Car insurance, $156. Groceries, maybe $200 if he stretched it. The severance would cover exactly 1 month, and that was only if he ignored the late fees already accumulating. After that, nothing. His laptop sat open on the kitchen table, Indeed.com mocking him with its cheerful interface. Ethan had applied to 47 jobs in the past 4 hours. Customer service representative, warehouse supervisor, retail management, delivery driver, anything that might provide immediate income. Each application had felt like throwing messages and bottles into an indifferent ocean. The apartment door clicked open, and Ava's voice, bright and unburdened, called out, "Daddy, you're home early!" Ethan shoved the eviction notice into his pocket and manufactured a smile. "Hey, baby girl, how was school?" Ava dumped her backpack by the door, a habit he'd given up correcting months ago, and launched into an elaborate story about how her friend Madison had brought a pet hamster for show and tell. She was wearing the purple sweater Ethan had bought her for her birthday, the one she'd begged for because it had sparkles that caught the light just right. It had been expensive, more than he should have spent, but the joy on her face had made it worth every penny. Now he wondered if that $50 might have been better saved. "And Mrs. Patterson said I got 100 on my spelling test," Ava beamed, pulling a paper from her backpack with a proud flourish. "She put a star sticker on it and everything." "That's my girl." Ethan pulled her into a hug, breathing in the scent of her strawberry shampoo, trying to memorize this moment before everything fell apart. "I'm so proud of you. Can we have pizza tonight, please? We haven't had pizza in forever." Forever, in Ava's timeline, meant about 3 weeks. Ethan thought about the $63 in his account, the bills piling up, the impossible arithmetic of survival. But he looked at his daughter's hopeful face and couldn't bring himself to add one more disappointment to the day. "Sure, baby. Pizza sounds perfect." Her squeal of delight was worth more than money, even if money was the only thing that could keep them off the streets. 317 miles away, in a corner office with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city, Claire Montgomery signed her name to a document that would put 47 people out of work. She did it without fanfare, without hesitation, because that was what the position required. CEO of Meridian Logistics meant making hard choices, meant prioritizing shareholder value over individual hardship. Her executive MBA from Wharton hadn't included a course on emotional attachment to organizational restructuring. The severance packages are standard, Gregory Sullivan, her CFO, assured her as he collected the signed papers. 2 weeks' pay, benefits continuation, more than generous considering we're eliminating their livelihoods, Claire finished, her tone neutral. Gregory shifted uncomfortably. He was good with numbers, less comfortable with the human costs behind them. Considering the market downturn and our obligation to our investors, we've hemorrhaged nearly $8 million this quarter alone through operational inefficiencies in the distribution chain. Claire leaned back in her chair, studying the city spread out before her. From this height, people were barely visible, tiny figures moving through their tiny lives, oblivious to the decisions made in rooms like this one. It was easier that way. Easier to think in terms of percentages and profit margins rather than families and futures. She'd taken over as CEO of Meridian 6 months ago, brought in by the board to reverse years of declining performance. The company her grandfather had built from a single delivery truck had grown bloated and complacent under previous leadership. Claire's mandate was simple: cut costs, restore profitability, and prove that a 34-year-old woman could handle the pressure of a 9-figure company. So far, she'd been ruthlessly efficient. "The distribution center layoffs will save us approximately $6.3 million annually," Gregory continued, warming to his favorite subject. "Combined with the warehouse consolidation in Ohio and the renegotiated supplier contracts, we should see positive momentum by Q3. "What about the VP of Operations position?" Claire asked. "Who are we promoting?" "Actually, I wanted to discuss that." Gregory pulled out another file, this one noticeably thicker. Robert Kellerman and James Preston have submitted a joint proposal. They're suggesting we eliminate the VP role entirely and distribute responsibilities between them as co-directors. They've outlined significant cost savings through redundancy elimination. Claire frowned. Something about that felt wrong, though she couldn't articulate why. That's an unusual structure. What's their justification? Mostly financial, but they've also flagged some concerns about the outgoing VP's management style, inefficiencies, resistance to modernization, that sort of thing. They've compiled quite a bit of documentation. Send me everything, Claire said. I want to review it before we finalize anything. After Gregory left, Claire stood at the window, watching the city lights begin to sparkle as dusk settled over the skyline. This office had belonged to her grandfather once. He'd started Meridian with nothing but determination and a willingness to outwork everyone else. By the time he'd retired, the company employed over 3,000 people across 6 states. The company hadn't just been his legacy, it had been his pride. Not because of the money or the prestige, but because he'd believed in taking care of people who worked hard and treated others with respect. Claire wondered what he'd think of her now, signing termination papers with the dispassionate efficiency of a surgeon removing diseased tissue. Her phone buzzed, a text from her mother. Reminder, charity gala Saturday night, Governor will be there. Wear the Armani. Claire deleted the message without responding. The gala, like most of her social obligations, existed primarily to maintain appearances. The daughter of privilege, born into wealth, expected to marry well and serve on the right boards. She defied those expectations by actually working, by earning her position through competence rather than coasting on her family name. But lately, she'd begun to wonder if there was really any difference. Whether you were ruthless by birthright or by ambition, the result was the same. People like those 47 terminated employees paid the price. She pushed the thought away and returned to her desk. There was still work to do, and sentiment was a luxury she couldn't afford. By 7 o'clock, Ethan's carefully maintained composure was crumbling. The pizza had been a temporary reprieve, Ava chattering happily about her day, unaware that each bite represented dollars they couldn't spare. Now she was in her room, supposedly doing homework, but more likely playing with the second-hand tablet Ethan had bought her last Christmas. He sat at the kitchen table, surrounded by papers that told the story of his unraveling. The eviction notice, overdue utility bills, credit card statements with balances he'd never be able to pay. His laptop screen glowed with rejection after rejection. Automated emails thanking him for his interest, but informing him that the company had decided to move forward with other candidates. Other candidates who probably hadn't been fired under suspicious circumstances. Other candidates whose references wouldn't include a former employer who'd eliminated their position with 2 weeks' notice. Ethan's phone rang. Unknown number. He almost didn't answer, but some desperate part of him hoped it might be a job opportunity. Mr. Brooks? This is Jennifer Carlson from Statewide Property Management. The voice was professionally apologetic, which somehow made it worse. I'm calling regarding your overdue rent payment. I received the eviction notice, Ethan said, trying to keep his voice steady. I'm working on resolving it. I just need a few more days. I understand this is difficult, but our policy is clear. Rent is considered late after the 3rd of the month. It's now the 8th. If payment isn't received by the 11th, we'll have no choice but to proceed with eviction. I lost my job today, Ethan said, hating how the words sounded. Like an excuse, like a failure. My severance check won't clear until next week. If you could just extend the deadline. I'm sorry, Mr. Brooks. The deadline is firm. I'd suggest reaching out to local assistance programs. There are resources available for people in your situation. People in your situation, like it was a category, a demographic. Like Ethan had somehow chosen this. After she hung up, Ethan sat in the gathering darkness of his kitchen, too tired to turn on the lights. 3 days. He had 3 days to come up with $1,850, plus late fees, or he and Ava would be on the street. He pulled up his email, hoping against hope for some miracle response to his job applications. Instead, he found a message from his sister in Portland. Hey, haven't heard from you in a while. Hope you and Ava are doing great. We're thinking of visiting for Thanksgiving. Let me know if that works. Ethan stared at the cheerful message, at the implied normalcy of it. His sister lived in a different world, One where Thanksgiving plans were made in advance, where visits were possibilities rather than impossibilities, where unemployment was something that happened to other people. He couldn't bring himself to respond. What would he even say? Actually, we'll be homeless by Thanksgiving, but sure, come visit us under the bridge. Daddy? Ava's voice, small and uncertain, came from the doorway. Are you okay? Ethan quickly wiped his eyes, though he hadn't realized he'd been crying. Yeah, baby, just tired. You get your homework done? She padded into the kitchen in her sock feet, her purple sweater sleeves rolled up. Mrs. Patterson says we're supposed to write about what we want to be when we grow up. I said I want to be a veterinarian because I love animals. What did you want to be when you were my age? The question was so innocent, so unburdened by the weight of failed dreams and harsh realities. Ethan pulled her onto his lap, grateful for the distraction from his spiraling thoughts. I wanted to be an astronaut, he said, surprising himself with the memory. I used to check out books about space from the library. I had all these posters of the planets on my bedroom wall. Why didn't you become an astronaut? Life took me in a different direction. It was the simplest truth he could offer. But you know what? I got something even better. What? I got you. He kissed the top of her head, breathing in her strawberry-scented hair. Best thing that ever happened to me. Ava giggled, squirming in his arms. Daddy, you're being mushy. That's my job. After he tucked her into bed, reading an extra chapter of her favorite book because he couldn't bear to cut the moment short, Ethan returned to the kitchen and the impossible mountain of problems waiting there. He pulled out his phone and did something he'd sworn he'd never do. He opened a cash advance app. The interest rates were predatory, the kind of thing that trapped desperate people in cycles of debt. But desperate was exactly what Ethan had become. He could borrow $2,000, cover rent and groceries, and deal with the consequences later, except his application was denied. Insufficient credit history, outstanding balance on existing accounts. The algorithm had calculated his worth and found him wanting. Ethan set the phone down carefully, afraid that if he moved too quickly, he might throw it across the room. He'd done everything right, worked hard, stayed loyal, paid his bills, raised his daughter alone after her mother had walked out when Ava was just 2 years old, deciding that motherhood and responsibility weren't part of her life plan, and this was what doing everything right had earned him. The rain started just after midnight, a steady downpour that matched Ethan's mood perfectly. He stood at the window, watching water stream down the glass, thinking about Sarah's warning. Those shipping manifests you flagged. They disappeared from the system. It had been such a small thing, really. Ethan had noticed discrepancies in the quarterly inventory report, shipments logged as received but never appearing in the distribution records. When he'd mentioned it to his supervisor, he'd been told not to worry about it, that accounting would handle any discrepancies. But Ethan had a mind that noticed patterns, that couldn't let inconsistencies slide. He'd kept digging, quietly, just trying to understand why the numbers didn't match. He'd never intended to cause trouble. He just wanted things to make sense, and now he was being punished for it. The rational part of his brain knew he should let it go. He had bigger problems than corporate fraud. But the rest of him, the part that still believed in fairness and accountability, couldn't quite release the anger building in his chest. Someone had stolen from the company. Someone had falsified records. And when Ethan had gotten close to discovering who, they'd eliminated him, erased his work, and destroyed his reputation in the process. It was almost 2 a.m. when exhaustion finally dragged him to the couch. He couldn't bring himself to sleep in his bedroom, not when the eviction notice sat on the kitchen table like a ticking bomb. Instead, he pulled an old blanket over himself and closed his eyes, listening to the rain and trying not to think about where he and Ava would be in 3 days. Claire Montgomery's alarm went off at 5:30 a.m., as it did every morning. She silenced it immediately, already alert despite only 4 hours of sleep. Insomnia had been her constant companion since taking over as CEO, her mind refusing to quiet, always processing problems, calculating solutions, planning 3 moves ahead. She went through her morning routine with mechanical efficiency. 30 minutes on the Peloton, a shower precisely hot enough to wake her fully, but not so hot as to waste time lingering. A breakfast of Greek yogurt and berries eaten while reviewing overnight emails from their European distribution centers. By 6:45, she was in her home office, video conferencing with the Singapore team about supply chain disruptions. By 7:30, she was in the back of a town car, heading toward headquarters while her assistant ran through the day's schedule. 8 o'clock monthly board review. 9:30, meeting with the legal team about the Ohio facility closure. 11 o'clock, lunch with the governor. Cancel the lunch, Claire said, not looking up from her tablet. Send flowers and my apologies. Schedule conflicts. Her assistant, Marcus Chen, no relation to the regional director who'd fired Ethan, made a note without comment. He learned early on that Claire's decisions were final, her time too valuable for activities that didn't directly advance the company's interests. You also have a 3 o'clock with Sullivan and the operations team, Marcus continued. They're presenting the final recommendations for the restructuring. Make sure I have all supporting documentation by 2, Claire said. I want time to review before we meet. The board review was routine, positive momentum in most sectors, concerning stagnation in others. Claire presented her restructuring plan with crisp confidence, answering questions with the kind of data-backed certainty that made dissent feel foolish. The board, mostly men in their 60s who'd been skeptical of her appointment, nodded along with grudging approval. It was only during the legal review that something caught Claire's attention. We've had an unusual request from the Seattle Distribution Center, the general counsel mentioned almost as an afterthought. An employee, former employee actually, has submitted a formal complaint alleging wrongful termination and requesting access to personnel records. What's unusual about that? Claire asked. We get wrongful termination claims constantly. That's what we pay legal for. It's the nature of the request. He's not asking for monetary damages. He's specifically requesting his performance reviews, attendance records, and any documentation related to his termination. He seems to think something was falsified. Claire felt a flicker of something, not quite concern, but close. Was something falsified? Of course not, the counsel assured her quickly, but it's odd. Most terminated employees want settlements, not paperwork. This one seems determined to prove something. What's his name? The counsel checked his notes. Ethan Brooks, mid-level distribution coordinator. Eliminated in last week's restructuring, by all accounts. Unremarkable. Unremarkable. Claire filed the name away, though she wasn't sure why. She signed off on the standard legal response, deny the request, offer a minimal settlement to make the problem disappear, and moved on to the next item on her agenda. But later, during a rare moment of quiet between meetings, she found herself pulling up the personnel file for Ethan Brooks. The photo showed a man in his mid-30s with tired eyes and a smile that looked practiced rather than genuine. His employment history was exactly as the counsel had described, unremarkable. 9 years of steady, unspectacular service. Performance reviews that ranged from satisfactory to exceeds expectations. No disciplinary actions, no complaints. And yet something nagged at Claire. She scrolled through the file, looking for whatever had triggered her instinct that something wasn't quite right. Then she saw it. A note in his final performance review dated just 3 weeks before his termination. Employee has raised concerns about inventory discrepancies that fall outside his scope of responsibility. Counseled on appropriate chain of command and reminded to focus on assigned duties. Claire frowned. That wasn't how performance reviews were supposed to read. They documented work quality, not attempts to report problems. And the date bothered her, 3 weeks before the restructuring, close enough to be connected, far enough to seem coincidental. She pulled up the restructuring proposal that Robert Kellerman and James Preston had submitted, the one that had eliminated the VP of Operations position and transferred authority to them as co-directors. The one that had conveniently included the termination of a distribution coordinator who'd reported inventory discrepancies. Claire's instincts, honed by years of spotting inconsistencies in complex business operations, began to whisper that something was very wrong. She closed the file, telling herself it was nothing. Coincidence. Correlation without causation. She had more important things to focus on than one terminated employee's paranoid theories about falsified records. But she didn't delete the file from her screen. And when Marcus appeared to remind her about her 3 o'clock meeting, she asked him to do something unusual. Pull the complete operations records for the Seattle Distribution Center for the past year, she said. I want shipping manifests, inventory reports, everything, And I want it on my desk by tomorrow morning. Marcus raised an eyebrow but didn't question. Yes, ma'am. Anything specific you're looking for? Just curious, Claire said, though they both knew she was never just curious about anything. Plus, the rain hadn't stopped. If anything, it had intensified, turning the world beyond the windshield into a blur of water and refracted streetlights. Ethan sat in the driver's seat of his elderly Honda Civic, the engine off to save gas, listening to the rhythmic drumming on the roof. Beside him, wrapped in her favorite blanket, the one with the unicorns that she'd had since she was 3. Ava slept with her head against the window. She'd cried for the first hour after they'd been forcibly removed from their apartment, security guards watching impassively as Ethan had loaded what few possessions they could carry into the car. Everything else, furniture, dishes, most of Ava's toys, the accumulated debris of their life together, had been left behind. The landlord would dispose of it or sell it or throw it away. Ethan didn't have the luxury of carrying which. His phone battery was at 3%, the charger buried somewhere in one of the bags in the trunk. He turned off all notifications to preserve power, but he could see the accumulation of messages and missed calls from numbers he didn't recognize. Debt collectors, probably. People who wanted money he didn't have for bills he couldn't pay. The only call that mattered, the one from a potential employer offering him a second chance, hadn't come. Ethan checked his bank balance one more time. $742. The pizza from yesterday felt like an indulgence from a different lifetime. He had less than $8, no home, and a daughter who trusted him to make everything okay. He'd parked in a 24-hour grocery store lot in a neighborhood he barely knew, far enough from their old apartment that he wouldn't run into anyone he knew, close enough to Ava's school that she could still attend tomorrow. Because somehow, impossibly, life continued. Ava still had school. Ethan still had job applications pending. The world kept turning even when yours had completely fallen apart. A tap on the window made him jump. A security guard stood in the rain, flashlight in hand, expression somewhere between suspicious and sympathetic. Ethan rolled down the window, bracing himself for another rejection, another move. "You can't sleep here," the guard said, but his tone was gentle. "Store policy." "I understand." Ethan's voice was hoarse from hours of silence. "We're just resting. We'll move on." The guard looked past Ethan to where Ava slept, her face peaceful despite everything. Something shifted in his expression. "There's a shelter about 3 miles from here, St. Mary's. They take families. Might be worth trying." "Thank you," Ethan managed. After the guard walked away, Ethan sat in the darkness, trying to gather the will to start the car, to drive to a homeless shelter and admit that he'd failed so completely that even temporary refuge was beyond his capability to provide. This was the bottom. This was what happened when you did everything right, and the system crushed you anyway. This was the reality that existed beneath all the platitudes about hard work and determination and bootstraps. Ava stirred, her eyes opening slowly. For a moment she looked confused, trying to orient herself in the darkened car. Then memory returned and Ethan watched her small face crumple. "Daddy," she whispered, "I want to go home." "I know, baby." He reached across to touch her hand, this small person who'd been given no choice about the circumstances of her life. "I know. Where are we going to sleep?" "I'll figure something out. I promise." It was a promise he had no idea how to keep, but it was all he had left to offer. Empty words and desperate hope that somehow, impossibly, things would get better. The rain continued to fall, and somewhere in the distance a clock struck midnight. Ethan Brooks, who'd worked hard and played by the rules and done everything society said would lead to security and stability, sat in a car that might not start tomorrow, watching his daughter cry, and wondered at what point good intentions had stopped being enough. What he didn't know, what he couldn't have known, was that 300 miles away, a woman who'd signed his termination papers without a second thought was beginning to ask the questions that would change everything, but that was still hours away. And in the immediate, impossible present, all Ethan had was rain and darkness, and the terrible certainty that tomorrow would bring no relief, only more of the same slow catastrophe that had become his life. He started the car, the engine coughing to life reluctantly, and drove into the night, searching for a shelter that might offer his daughter a warm place to sleep. Behind them, everything they'd built together disappeared into the rain. The shelter smelled of industrial disinfectant and desperation. Ethan carried a sleeping Ava through the double doors just after 1 a.m, her weight against his chest, the only thing keeping him tethered to any sense of purpose. A tired woman at the intake desk, her name tag read Gloria, looked up from her paperwork with eyes that had seen this scene 1,000 times before. Family intake closed at 11, she said, but her tone wasn't unkind. But given the weather and the child, I can make an exception. How old is she? 7, Ethan said. His voice sounded strange to his own ears, hollow and distant. We just need somewhere warm for tonight. Maybe tomorrow night. Until I can figure something out. Gloria nodded slowly, pulling out a clipboard. I'll need to see identification for both of you. We have room in the family section, separate from the general population. Dinner service ended hours ago, but I can probably find some crackers and peanut butter if she's hungry. The paperwork was humiliating in its thoroughness. Current address, none. Current employment, none. Reason for homelessness, check the box marked eviction. Emergency contact. Ethan stared at that line for a long moment before leaving it blank. His sister didn't need to know. Not yet. Maybe not ever. The family section consisted of 6 rooms separated by thin walls that did nothing to muffle the sound of crying children and whispered arguments. The room Gloria led them to contained 2 narrow cots, a small dresser with drawers that didn't quite close, and a crucifix on the wall that Ethan tried not to look at. He laid Ava on one of the cots, covering her with the thin blanket provided, and sat on the edge of the other, too exhausted to sleep. His phone was dead now, the screen dark and unresponsive. For the first time in his adult life, Ethan was completely disconnected from the world. No emails, no job alerts, no way for anyone to reach him even if they wanted to. The isolation was almost physical, a weight pressing down on his chest. Through the wall, someone was coughing, deep, rattling sounds that spoke of illness left untreated too long. Down the hall, a baby wailed inconsolably. These were the sounds of poverty, of systems that had failed, of people who'd fallen through cracks that society pretended didn't exist. Ethan had never imagined he'd be one of them. He must have dozed eventually because he woke to gray morning light filtering through a window too high to see out of, and Ava's hand shaking his shoulder. "Daddy, where are we?" The question was so simple, the answer so complicated. Ethan sat up, his back aching from the too soft mattress, and tried to find words that wouldn't terrify her. "We're at a place that helps families who need somewhere to stay for a little while," he said carefully. "Just until Daddy finds a new job and we can get our own place again." Ava looked around the sparse room, her expression too old for her 7 years. "Like a hotel?" "Sort of like that." "I don't like it here. It smells funny." "I know, baby. I don't like it either. But it's warm and safe, and that's what matters right now." Ethan stood, his joints protesting. "Come on, let's see if we can find you some breakfast." The cafeteria was already crowded by 7 a.m., families clustered around tables eating scrambled eggs that looked slightly gray and toast that was either burned or barely toasted. Ethan got them each a tray, found a table in the corner, and watched Ava push food around her plate without eating. "You need to eat something," he said gently. "I'm not hungry." "Ava, when can we go home?" Her voice was small, breaking on the last word. "When can we go back to our real house?" Ethan felt something crack inside his chest. "I'm working on it. I promise I'm working on it." But the promise felt increasingly hollow. What was he working on, exactly? He had no phone, no computer, no way to even apply for jobs. The library would be open soon. He could use their computers, charge his phone, but then what? Even if a miracle occurred and someone hired him today, it would be weeks before he saw a paycheck. Weeks of living in the shelter, of watching his daughter's spirit dim a little more each day. A woman sat down across from them, her own tray of gray eggs untouched. She was maybe in her 40s, with prematurely silver hair and a face that suggested she'd been beautiful once, before circumstances had worn her down. "First time?" she asked, her voice carrying the flat affect of someone who'd learned not to invest too much emotion in anything. Ethan nodded. "Thought so. You've got that shell-shocked look." She stirred her eggs absently. How'd you end up here? Lost my job. Couldn't pay rent. Yeah, that's how it goes. I'm Rebecca. Been here off and on for 2 years. Lost my apartment when the building got sold and the new owners tripled the rent. Couldn't afford anything else on what I make at the diner. She glanced at Ava, who was still staring at her food. It's hardest on the kids. They don't understand why the rules changed. I'm trying to find work, Ethan said. Something stable. Anything, really. Rebecca's laugh was bitter. Good luck with that. You know what employers see when they look at you? Someone with a shelter address? Someone without stability. Someone who's already failed once. She must have seen something in his face because her expression softened slightly. I'm not trying to be cruel, just honest. This system isn't designed to help people get out. It's designed to manage them while they're in it. After breakfast, Ethan walked Ava to school. It was a 40-minute walk from the shelter, but the bus required money they didn't have. Ava was quiet the entire way, her small hand in his, her backpack, containing the few school supplies they'd managed to salvage, bouncing against her shoulders. At the school entrance, she hesitated. What if someone asks where we live now? She said quietly. The question gutted him. She was 7 years old and already learning the shame of poverty, already understanding that her circumstances were something to hide. Tell them we're staying with friends while we look for a new place, Ethan said. It's nobody's business but ours. She nodded, but the sadness in her eyes didn't fade. Ethan watched her walk through the doors, her purple sweater bright against the gray morning, and wondered how many more days he could keep sending her to school before the administration started asking questions about their housing situation. The public library didn't open until 9. Ethan spent the intervening hour walking aimlessly through neighborhoods where people lived normal lives, getting into cars to drive to jobs, returning from morning runs, walking dogs. The mundane rituals of stability that he'd taken for granted until 48 hours ago. When the library finally opened, Ethan claimed a computer in the back corner and plugged in his phone. While it charged, he refreshed his job search, applied to 17 more positions, and tried not to think about Rebecca's words. Someone who's already failed once. His email contained the usual rejections, but also something unexpected. A message from an address he didn't recognize, sent late last night. The subject line read, "You were right about the shipments." Ethan's hand hesitated over the mouse before clicking open. "Mr. Brooks, you don't know me, but I work in the Seattle Distribution Center accounting department. I heard you were terminated last week. I also heard why, even though the official reason was restructuring. I've been noticing the same discrepancies you flagged, shipments that don't match inventory, numbers that don't add up. After you were fired, I started digging deeper. I think there's something seriously wrong with the books, and I think someone powerful doesn't want it discovered. I can't say more over email, but if you want to talk, I'm willing to meet. You deserve to know what you were fired for noticing. A friend." Ethan read the message 3 times, his pulse quickening with each pass. Someone else had seen the irregularities. Someone else was willing to confirm that his termination hadn't been about performance or restructuring. It had been about silence. But what good did that knowledge do him? He was homeless, unemployed, with no resources to fight back against a company that had already demonstrated its willingness to crush him. What was the point of knowing the truth if he couldn't do anything with it? Still, something in him, the part that had always believed in fairness, in accountability, in the idea that right should matter more than power, couldn't let it go. He typed out a response before he could second-guess himself. "I'll meet you." When and where? The response came within minutes. "Tonight, 7 p.m. Riverside Park, North Entrance. Come alone. And Mr. Brooks, be careful. Whatever's happening at Meridian, it's big enough that people are willing to destroy lives to keep it hidden." 300 miles away, Claire Montgomery was discovering exactly how big the problem at Meridian actually was. The operations records Marcus had delivered that morning covered her desk in organized chaos. Printouts of shipping manifests, inventory reports, quarterly audits, and financial statements. Claire had spent the past 4 hours cross-referencing documents, building spreadsheets, and following threads of inconsistency that seemed to lead everywhere and nowhere at once. The discrepancies were subtle at first, shipments logged as delivered to vendors that didn't quite match the vendors' receiving records. Inventory counts that fluctuated in ways that didn't align with sales data. Small variations that could almost be explained by clerical errors or system glitches. Almost, but not quite. Claire's background in forensic accounting, a specialty she'd developed during her MBA, had taught her to recognize patterns in financial irregularities. And these irregularities had a pattern. They all flowed through two specific accounts, both managed by Robert Kellerman and James Preston, the same executives now proposing to eliminate the VP position and consolidate power. She pulled up the personnel file for Ethan Brooks again, reading his final performance review more carefully this time. Employee has raised concerns about inventory discrepancies that fall outside his scope of responsibility. What if those concerns hadn't been outside his scope? What if he'd accidentally stumbled onto something that implicated people with the power to eliminate threats? Claire reached for her phone, then hesitated. If she was right, if Kellerman and Preston were involved in some kind of fraud, then alerting them would give them time to cover their tracks. She needed to be certain before she made any accusations. She called down to HR instead. "This is Claire Montgomery. I need the complete employment file for Ethan Brooks, former distribution coordinator. Not the summary. Everything. Performance reviews, disciplinary records, exit interview notes, time card records, correspondence. I want it on my desk within the hour." "Is there a problem, Ms. Montgomery?" The HR director's voice carried a note of concern. "I'm conducting a routine audit," Claire said smoothly. "Nothing to worry about." While she waited for the file, Claire did something she rarely did. She called her grandfather. He was 83 now, retired for a decade, living in a sprawling house overlooking the Sound. His mind remained sharp even as his body had begun to fail, and Claire valued his counsel more than she'd ever admit aloud. "Claire Bear," he answered, using the childhood nickname that no one else was allowed. "To what do I owe the pleasure of a mid-morning call from my workaholic granddaughter?" "I need advice," Claire said, "about the company." "Well, that's refreshing. You usually have everything figured out before you call to tell me about it afterward." His tone was teasing, but not unkind. "What's troubling you?" "If you suspected someone in the company was stealing, someone high level with the power to cover their tracks, what would you do?" There was a long pause. When her grandfather spoke again, his voice had lost its lightness. "Is this hypothetical, or are we talking about something real?" "I'm not sure yet. But I'm seeing things that don't add up, and I think someone might have been fired for noticing the same things." "Then you investigate thoroughly before you act," he said firmly. "But Claire, you listen to me. If someone is willing to destroy a man's career to protect their secret, they won't hesitate to destroy yours too. Be very careful about who you trust with this information." "I know how to handle corporate politics, Grandpa." "This isn't politics. This is corruption. There's a difference." He sighed, and Claire heard the weight of experience in it. "I built Meridian on a principle that seems quaint now. Treat people fairly, and they'll treat you fairly in return. If someone in that company has forgotten that principle, it's your job to remind them. But do it smart. Do it safe." After they hung up, Claire sat with his words, thinking about the company her grandfather had built and what it had become under her leadership. She'd made hard choices, eliminated positions, prioritized profit over sentiment, but she'd done it transparently, by the rules, believing that sometimes leadership meant making decisions that hurt in the short term but strengthened the organization long term. What she hadn't done, what she would never do, was destroy someone's life to cover up a crime. The HR file arrived in a sealed envelope. Claire opened it and began to read, building a timeline of Ethan Brooks's employment. The story it told was damning, but not in the way his terminators had intended. Every performance review until the final one had praised his attention to detail, his reliability, his initiative. Then, 3 weeks before his termination, a sudden note about overstepping boundaries and creating unnecessary concerns. 2 weeks later, a memo from Kellerman noting that Brooks's position was being marked for elimination due to redundancy. The timing was too convenient. The shift in tone too abrupt. Claire pulled up the exit interview notes, expecting the standard bland responses. Instead, she found something else. A note from the HR representative who'd conducted the interview. Employee seemed confused and upset by termination. Repeatedly insisted his performance had been exemplary. When told his position was eliminated due to restructuring, he asked why his concerns about inventory discrepancies had never been investigated. I advised him that operational decisions were above my authority and wished him well. He left without signing the standard exit documentation. He'd refused to sign. That was unusual enough to be notable. Most terminated employees signed whatever was put in front of them, too shocked or defeated to resist. But Ethan Brooks had refused, maintaining his innocence even in the face of certain defeat. Claire made a decision that went against every instinct of self-preservation she possessed. She picked up her phone and dialed the HR director again. "I need contact information for Ethan Brooks," she said. "Personal phone number, last known address, everything we have." "Ms. Montgomery, I'm not sure that's advisable. If he's considering legal action, I'm not calling to threaten him. I'm calling to talk to him. The information, please." The HR director reluctantly provided a phone number and an address. Claire dialed immediately, pacing her office while the line rang once, twice, 3 times. Then a recording. "The number you have reached has been disconnected or is no longer in service." She tried the address next, calling the property management company listed in his file. "I'm trying to reach a former tenant," Claire said when someone finally answered. "Ethan Brooks, apartment 3C. Do you know how I can contact him?" "Mr. Brooks?" The woman's voice turned cool. "He was evicted 3 days ago for non-payment of rent, left no forwarding address. If he owes you money, you can get in line with everyone else." Claire hung up slowly, the full weight of what she'd done beginning to settle on her shoulders. Ethan Brooks hadn't just lost his job. He'd lost his home. And she, Claire Montgomery, CEO, champion of efficiency and accountability, had signed the papers that set that destruction in motion. She returned to her desk and opened her laptop, pulling up the financial records again. But this time, she wasn't looking at patterns. She was looking at a specific set of transactions that had caught her eye earlier, regular payments from Meridian's operating account to a consulting firm she'd never heard of. 20 minutes of research revealed that the consulting firm was a shell company, registered in Delaware with no website, no employees, and no apparent purpose except to receive payments from Meridian Logistics. Payments totaling nearly $6 million over the past 18 months, all authorized by Robert Kellerman and James Preston. Claire sat back in her chair, her heart pounding. This wasn't just fraud. This was systematic theft on a massive scale, carefully disguised as legitimate business expenses. And when Ethan Brooks had gotten close to uncovering it, when his attention to detail had threatened to expose the whole scheme, they'd eliminated him with surgical precision. Her grandfather's warning echoed in her mind. If someone is willing to destroy a man's career to protect their secret, they won't hesitate to destroy yours too. Claire had spent 6 months as CEO, proving she was tough enough, smart enough, ruthless enough to lead a major corporation. Now she faced a different test entirely, whether she had the courage to do what was right, even when it meant risking everything she'd built. She thought about Ethan Brooks, homeless somewhere with a daughter who depended on him, punished for having the integrity to notice when something was wrong. She thought about her grandfather's company, founded on principles of fairness and honesty, corrupted from within by people who saw opportunity in other people's trust. She thought about the 47 families she'd displaced with her restructuring, about all the lives touched by decisions made in rooms like this one, by people who never had to face the consequences of their choices. And she made a decision that would change everything. Claire picked up her phone and called her personal attorney, not the company's counsel, who reported to the board, but her own lawyer who answered only to her. "Richard, I need you to do something quietly. I need you to hire a private investigator, the best one you know. I need them to track down a man named Ethan Brooks. Last known address is in Seattle, recently evicted. I need to know where he is, and I need to know it by tomorrow." "What's this about, Claire?" "I think I've made a terrible mistake," she said quietly, "and I need to fix it before it's too late." That evening, as sunset painted the Seattle skyline in shades of amber and rose, Ethan Brooks walked toward Riverside Park with his phone in his pocket and fear in his chest. He'd left Ava at the shelter with Rebecca, who'd promised to make sure she got dinner and help with her homework. The guilt of leaving her, even for a few hours, sat heavy in his stomach. The park was mostly empty, the evening chill keeping casual visitors away. Ethan made his way to the north entrance, scanning the shadows for whoever had reached out to him. For several minutes, nothing happened. He was beginning to think it had been a cruel prank when a figure emerged from beneath a cluster of trees. She was younger than Ethan had expected, maybe late 20s, with sharp eyes and nervous hands that wouldn't stop moving. "Mr. Brooks?" she said quietly. "I'm Miranda Chen. I'm the one who emailed you." "You said you work in accounting," Ethan said, keeping his voice low. "What did you find?" Miranda glanced around nervously before pulling a folder from her bag. "I shouldn't be doing this. I could lose my job. But what they did to you, it wasn't right." She handed him the folder. "These are copies of shipping manifests and inventory reports from the past year. Look at the highlighted sections." Ethan opened the folder, squinting at the numbers in the fading light. Even at a glance, the discrepancies were obvious once you knew to look for them. Shipments that appeared in the manifests but never showed up in inventory, receiving records that didn't match delivery confirmations, a systematic pattern of materials simply vanishing. "Where's it all going?" he asked. "That's the thing. I don't know. The shipments are marked as delivered to secondary distribution centers, but those centers report never receiving them. Someone is intercepting materials worth millions of dollars and selling them off market, and they've been doing it for at least 2 years. Kellerman and Preston," Ethan said, the pieces clicking into place. "They're the only ones with access to authorize these shipments." Miranda nodded. "After you were fired, I started paying closer attention. They're careful. They never take too much at once, never from the same accounts 2 months in a row, but it adds up. I estimate they've stolen somewhere between $4 and $6 million worth of materials." The number made Ethan's head spin. He'd lost everything, his job, his home, his daughter's stability, because he'd accidentally threatened to expose a multi-million-dollar theft ring. "Why are you telling me this?" he asked. "What am I supposed to do with it?" "I don't know," Miranda admitted. "But someone should know the truth. And you deserve to know why you were really fired." She backed away, glancing nervously over her shoulder. "I have to go. They can't know I met with you. If this folder ever surfaces, you found it yourself. I was never here." "Wait!" Ethan called, but she was already hurrying away, disappearing into the gathering darkness. He stood alone in the park, holding evidence of crimes that had destroyed his life, with no idea what to do next. He had proof, but who would believe him? A homeless man with an axe to grind against his former employer. The folder in his hands felt simultaneously like a weapon and a curse. His phone buzzed. A text from Rebecca. "Ava's asking for you. Everything okay?" No, Ethan thought. Everything was very far from okay. But he texted back, "On my way." He walked back toward the shelter through streets that felt different now, charged with possibility and danger in equal measure. Somewhere in this city, powerful men were sleeping soundly in expensive homes, unaware that their crimes had finally been documented. And somewhere else, a CEO was just beginning to understand the true cost of the efficiency she'd championed. The pieces were in motion. The truth was emerging from shadow into light. And Ethan Brooks, who'd lost everything for the crime of being honest, suddenly held the power to make people pay attention. He just had to figure out how to use it without getting crushed in the process. The rain had started again by the time he reached the shelter, a steady drizzle that matched his mood. He found Ava in their room, sitting on her cot with one of the donated books from the shelter's small library. Her eyes lit up when she saw him. "Daddy, where were you?" "Just taking care of some things," Ethan said, tucking the folder into his bag before she could see it. "Did you eat dinner?" "Rebecca made sure I got extra applesauce. She's nice." "Yeah, she is." Ethan sat beside her, pulling her close. "I'm sorry I left you." "It's okay." Ava leaned against him, her voice small. "Daddy, are we always going to live here?" The question broke his heart. "No, baby. This is just temporary. I promise we're going to find our own place again." "How?" It was the most devastating question she could have asked because Ethan didn't have an answer. But looking at her hopeful face, he realized that maybe, just maybe, the folder in his bag represented more than just proof of crimes. It represented leverage, a way back from the edge of oblivion. He just had to be brave enough to use it. "I'm working on something," he told her. "Something that might help us, and a lot of other people too. But I need you to trust me, okay? Can you do that?" Ava nodded solemnly. "I always trust you, Daddy." Her faith in him felt like both a gift and a burden. Ethan held her tighter, staring at the crucifix on the wall he'd been trying to ignore, and made a silent vow. He would find a way to use what he knew. He would make the people who destroyed his life face consequences. Not for revenge, though he'd be lying if he said the thought didn't appeal to him, but for Ava, for every other family that had been casualties of corporate greed and systematic corruption, for the principle that honesty and integrity should matter more than power and profit. Outside, the rain fell harder, washing the city clean. And in her corner office overlooking that city, Claire Montgomery was making similar vows, setting in motion events that would bring her and Ethan Brooks into collision course with each other and with the truth that threatened to destroy them both. The storm was just beginning. The private investigator's report landed on Claire's desk at 8:47 a.m., exactly 23 hours after she'd requested it. She'd spent most of the night in her office, cross-referencing financial records and building a case that grew more damning with each document she reviewed. Now, exhausted but wired on her fourth cup of coffee, she opened the folder that would tell her where to find Ethan Brooks. The information was sparse but devastating. Current residence, St. Mary's Family Shelter, downtown Seattle. Employment status, unemployed. Vehicle, 2009 Honda Civic, registered in his name, likely serving as secondary storage given the shelter's space limitations. One dependent, daughter, age 7, currently enrolled at Madison Elementary. Claire stared at the address of the shelter for a long time, trying to reconcile the abstract concept of restructuring casualties with the concrete reality of a man and his child sleeping in a homeless shelter because she'd signed a piece of paper without asking enough questions. Her phone buzzed. A text from her assistant. Kellerman and Preston are here for your 9 a.m., conference room B. Claire took a breath, closed the investigator's report, and gathered the evidence she'd compiled through the night. She'd slept perhaps 90 minutes, showered in the executive bathroom, and changed into the spare suit she kept in her office for emergencies. She looked composed, professional, every inch the competent CEO. Inside, she was terrified. The walk to the conference room felt longer than usual. Through the glass walls, she could see Robert Kellerman and James Preston already seated, reviewing documents, confident in their territory. They'd worked at Meridian for over 15 years each, rising through the ranks through a combination of competence and political savvy. They were respected, well-connected, and by all accounts, excellent at their jobs. They were also thieves who destroyed a man's life to protect their scheme. Claire entered the conference room with her evidence folder tucked under her arm. Both men stood, offering professional smiles. "Claire," Kellerman said warmly. He was in his early 50s, silver-haired and distinguished, the kind of executive who looked natural in boardrooms and country clubs. "Thanks for making time this morning. James and I have been refining the operations restructure, and we think you'll be pleased with the projections." "Before we get to that," Claire said, settling into her chair at the head of the table, "I need to ask you both some questions about the Seattle Distribution Center." Something flickered in Preston's eyes. He was younger than Kellerman, 42, ambitious, always angling for his next promotion. "Of course. What would you like to know?" "I've been reviewing our shipping manifests and inventory reports from the past 18 months. Claire opened her folder, spreading documents across the table. "I'm seeing some discrepancies I'd like you to explain." Kellerman leaned forward, his expression shifting to one of professional concern. "What kind of discrepancies?" "Shipments marked as delivered to secondary distribution centers that have no record of receiving them. Inventory counts that don't align with our sales data. Regular payments to consulting firms that don't appear to provide any actual services." Claire's voice remained calm, but she watched both men carefully. "Can either of you explain why these irregularities exist?" Preston's face had gone carefully blank, the look of someone working hard to appear unconcerned. "I'd need to see the specific documents. Sometimes there are clerical errors, delays in system updates." "These aren't clerical errors," Claire interrupted. She slid a spreadsheet across the table. "This is a pattern of systematic theft spanning at least 2 years. Materials worth approximately $5.8 million have been diverted from legitimate distribution channels, and every single one of these transactions was authorized by one or both of you." The silence that followed was electric. Kellerman's professional mask slipped for just a moment, revealing something cold and calculating beneath. Then he smiled, and it was like watching a predator bare its teeth. That's a serious accusation, Claire. I hope you have ironclad proof before you make claims like that. I do. Claire met his gaze steadily, refusing to let him see her fear. I have shipping records, inventory audits, financial statements, and testimony from an accountant who's been documenting the discrepancies. I also have evidence that you eliminated an employee specifically because he noticed these irregularities and reported them through proper channels. You're talking about Brooks, Preston said, his voice tight. That was a performance issue, nothing more. Ethan Brooks had exemplary performance reviews until 3 weeks before you fired him. The only thing that changed was that he reported inventory discrepancies that threatened to expose your scheme. Claire felt her anger building, carefully controlled but present. You destroyed that man's life to protect yourselves. Kellerman leaned back in his chair, his expression hardening. Even if what you're suggesting were true, and I'm not admitting anything, you have to understand the position you're putting yourself in. James and I have relationships throughout this industry. We know board members, investors, competitors. If you pursue this, it won't just be our careers at stake. It'll be yours too. Is that a threat? It's reality. Kellerman's voice was almost gentle, like he was explaining something to a slow child. You're young, Claire. Brilliant, but inexperienced. Corporate politics isn't about right and wrong. It's about power and perception. You accuse us without absolute proof. We'll bury you in legal proceedings and board investigations. We'll paint you as a paranoid executive who couldn't handle the pressure. Your career will be over before you're 35. And if I have absolute proof, then you have a choice to make, Preston said quietly. You can expose this, destroy your own company's reputation in the process, tank the stock price, face years of litigation, and maybe see some justice done. Or you can let us quietly resign, return the money over time, and protect the company and everyone who depends on it, including yourself. Claire had known this moment was coming. She'd rehearsed her response through the long night, but actually facing it was different. These men were offering her a way out, a path that would protect her position and spare the company the scandal. All she had to do was compromise her integrity and abandon any sense of justice for Ethan Brooks. It would be the smart play, the safe play, the kind of decision that CEOs made every day when they chose expediency over principle. She thought about her grandfather building this company on the belief that fairness mattered. She thought about Ethan Brooks sleeping in a shelter with his daughter because he'd had the integrity to report what he'd seen. She thought about every other employee who'd trusted that working hard and doing the right thing would be enough. No, Claire said quietly. That's not how this ends. Kellerman's expression darkened. You're making a mistake. Maybe, but it's my mistake to make. Claire stood, gathering her documents. You're both suspended effective immediately, pending a full investigation. Security will escort you from the building. I'll be presenting this evidence to the board this afternoon, along with my recommendation for criminal prosecution. You self-righteous, Preston started, but Kellerman put a hand on his arm, stopping him. Think very carefully about what you're about to do, Kellerman said, his voice low and dangerous. You're not just taking us down. You're taking down the company. Your company. Is that really worth it for one fired employee? This isn't about one employee, Claire said. It's about what this company stands for, or what it should stand for. She walked out of the conference room, her heart pounding so hard she thought they might hear it. Her hands shook as she pulled out her phone and called security, issuing instructions for Kellerman and Preston's immediate removal from the building. Then she called her assistant. Clear my schedule for the rest of the day, and I need an emergency board meeting scheduled for this afternoon. Tell them it's urgent. All of them? Miss Montgomery, half the board is... All of them, Claire repeated firmly. Whatever it takes. This can't wait. After hanging up, she stood in the hallway watching through the glass as security guards entered the conference room. Kellerman and Preston stood, their faces masks of controlled fury, and allowed themselves to be escorted toward the elevators. Preston looked back once, and the hatred in his eyes was unmistakable. Claire had just made powerful enemies, men with connections, resources, and every motivation to destroy her credibility. She'd gambled her entire career on being right about this, on having enough evidence to withstand their counterattacks. She walked back to her office and picked up the investigator's report on Ethan Brooks. She'd set in motion the machinery of justice, but justice was slow and uncertain. Meanwhile, a man who'd done nothing wrong was living in a shelter with his daughter, punished for having the integrity that Claire was now claiming to champion. That felt wrong. Incomplete. She picked up her phone and dialed her personal attorney again. "Richard, I need you to do something else for me. That man you tracked down, Ethan Brooks. I need you to contact him and arrange a meeting, today if possible. Tell him Claire Montgomery wants to speak with him personally." "Claire, I strongly advise against direct contact. If this becomes a legal matter, it's already a legal matter. But before it goes any further, I need to look him in the eye and tell him what I'm about to do." She paused, trying to find the right words. "I need him to know that someone is finally listening." Across the city, Ethan was sitting in the shelter's common room, the folder from Miranda Chen hidden in his bag, trying to figure out what to do next. Ava was at school, and he had the day stretching ahead of him with nothing to fill it but anxiety and impossible choices. The folder represented power, evidence of crimes, leverage against the people who'd destroyed his life. But Ethan had no idea how to use it. He could go to the police, but corporate fraud investigations took months or years, and he didn't have months. He could go to the media, but what reporter would believe a homeless man with a grudge against his former employer? He could do nothing, which felt like the safest option and also the most cowardly. His phone buzzed. A call from an unknown number. Ethan almost ignored it. Unknown numbers rarely brought good news, but something made him answer. "Mr. Brooks, my name is Richard Chen. I'm an attorney representing Claire Montgomery, CEO of Meridian Logistics. Ms. Montgomery would like to meet with you today to discuss your termination and some related matters. Would you be available?" Ethan's mind went blank. The CEO wanted to meet with him. The same person who'd signed off on his firing now wanted to talk? "Is this some kind of legal threat?" he asked carefully. "Because I can't afford a lawyer to—" "No threat, Mr. Brooks. Ms. Montgomery specifically instructed me to emphasize that this is a voluntary meeting. She has information she believes you need to hear, and she's hoping you'll give her the chance to explain in person. I can arrange for a car to pick you up wherever you are." "Why?" Ethan's voice was sharper than he intended. "Why does she suddenly care what happened to me?" There was a pause. When the attorney spoke again, his voice carried a note of something almost like respect. "I think she's realized she made a mistake, and I think she's trying to fix it. Will you meet with her?" Ethan thought about the folder in his bag, about Miranda Chen's warning to be careful, about powerful people who'd already demonstrated their willingness to destroy him. Meeting with the CEO felt dangerous, potentially stupid, but it also felt like the first time in days that someone with actual power was acknowledging that what happened to him mattered. "Where and when?" he asked. "There's a coffee shop called Riverside Grounds, near the park. Can you be there at noon?" "I'll be there." After hanging up, Ethan sat motionless for several minutes, trying to process what had just happened. Rebecca wandered over, carrying her ever-present cup of terrible shelter coffee. "You look like you just got hit by a truck," she observed. "Good news or bad news?" "I'm not sure yet." Ethan stood, grabbing his bag. "I need to go out for a few hours. If Ava gets back from school before I do, I'll make sure she's fed and has help with homework. Go do whatever you need to do." Rebecca studied his face. "Just be careful. People like us don't usually get surprise opportunities. Sometimes they're traps." "I know." But Ethan went anyway, because what choice did he have? He walked the 40 minutes to Riverside Grounds, arriving 15 minutes early, and claimed a table in the back corner where he could watch the door. The coffee shop was quiet, populated mostly by students with laptops and professionals having casual meetings. It was the kind of place Ethan used to frequent before his life imploded, back when a $5 latte felt like an affordable luxury rather than an impossible extravagance. He ordered water and waited. Claire Montgomery arrived exactly at noon, and Ethan recognized her immediately from the few company-wide emails that had included her photo. She was younger than he'd expected, dressed in an expensive suit that probably cost more than 2 months of his former rent, looking simultaneously powerful and uncertain. She spotted him and walked over, her expression difficult to read. "Mr. Brooks?" "Miss Montgomery. Thank you for meeting with me. I wasn't sure you would. She sat across from him, setting her bag on the empty chair. Can I buy you coffee? Something to eat? I'm fine. The lie was automatic. Ethan hadn't eaten since the shelter's gray eggs that morning, and he could feel hunger gnawing at his stomach, but accepting food from the person who'd destroyed his life felt like a surrender he wasn't ready to make. Claire seemed to understand. She ordered nothing for herself, just sat looking at him with an expression that might have been guilt. I owe you an apology, she said finally. And I know that's inadequate, but I don't have better words. I signed off on your termination as part of a restructuring plan without asking enough questions about why you specifically were being let go. I didn't do my due diligence, and you paid the price for my negligence. Ethan stared at her, trying to reconcile this apology with the fury that had been building in him for days. You destroyed my life with the stroke of a pen. My daughter and I are living in a homeless shelter because you couldn't be bothered to ask questions. I know, and I can't undo that. But I can tell you that I've spent the past 48 hours investigating what happened to you, and I've discovered something you need to know. Claire pulled out a folder, different from the one Ethan carried, but likely containing similar information. You weren't fired because of restructuring. You were fired because you threatened to expose a multi-million-dollar theft operation being run by 2 senior executives. I know, Ethan said quietly. Someone from accounting contacted me, gave me evidence. Claire's eyes widened slightly. Then you know about Kellerman and Preston? I know they've been stealing from the company for at least 2 years. I know they falsified my performance records and got me fired to protect themselves. I know that everything that's happened to me is because I noticed something was wrong and tried to do the right thing. Ethan's voice was steady, but his hands clenched into fists under the table. What I don't know is what I'm supposed to do about it. I have evidence, but I'm homeless and unemployed. Who's going to listen to me? I am, Claire said. I suspended both of them this morning. I'm presenting the evidence to the board this afternoon, and I'm recommending criminal prosecution. I'm also issuing a public statement acknowledging that your termination was unjust and that you were targeted specifically for trying to protect the company's interests. The words hit Ethan like a physical force. For days, he'd been drowning in the certainty that no one cared, that justice was a fairy tale told to children. And now the CEO of the company that had destroyed him was saying she believed him. Why? He asked. Why are you doing this? You could just bury it, protect the company's reputation. Why risk your own position for someone like me? Claire was quiet for a moment, and when she spoke, her voice carried a weight that suggested she'd been asking herself the same question. Because my grandfather built this company on the principle that people matter, that if you treat people fairly, with dignity and respect, they'll return that treatment. Somewhere along the way, under previous leadership and maybe under mine too, we lost sight of that. We started treating people as numbers on spreadsheets instead of human beings with families and lives. She met his eyes directly. You were loyal to Meridian for 9 years. You did your job well. You reported problems through proper channels, and in return, we threw you away like garbage. That's not what this company should be. That's not what I want it to be. Pretty words, Ethan said, and he heard the bitterness in his own voice. But words don't pay rent. Words don't feed my daughter. Words don't undo the past week of her life, sleeping in a shelter, being afraid because her father can't protect her. No, they don't. Claire pulled an envelope from her bag, which is why I'm also offering you full back pay for the time since your termination, plus compensation for your moving expenses and first and last month's rent on a new apartment. I'm offering you reinstatement at Meridian with a promotion to a position that better suits your skills and integrity. And I'm setting up a meeting with our legal team to discuss additional compensation for what you've been through. Ethan stared at the envelope like it might explode. What's the catch? No catch. This is what we owe you. What I owe you. Claire pushed the envelope across the table. Inside is a check for $47,000. That's your back pay, severance that should have been more substantial, and an advance on the compensation package we'll be discussing. It's not enough, I know it's not enough, but it's a start. Ethan's hands trembled as he picked up the envelope. $47,000. More money than he'd ever had at once. Enough to start over, to give Ava stability again, to stop living in constant terror of the next disaster. There's something else you should know, Claire continued. When I present this evidence to the board this afternoon, there's going to be fallout. Kellerman and Preston have connections throughout the industry. They're going to fight back, and they're going to try to discredit both of us. I need you to be prepared for that. Let them try, Ethan said, his voice hardening. I've already lost everything. What else can they take from me? Your reputation, your daughter's sense of safety, your ability to move forward. Claire's expression was serious. I'm not going to lie to you. This is going to get ugly before it gets better. But if you're willing to stand with me, if you're willing to testify about what you discovered and why you were really fired, we can make sure they face real consequences. Ethan thought about Ava, about the trust in her eyes when she'd said she always believed in him. He thought about all the other people who'd be fired or displaced by Kellerman and Preston's schemes if someone didn't stop them. He thought about the kind of world he wanted his daughter to grow up in, one where power protected wrongdoing or one where integrity actually mattered. I'll testify, he said. I'll tell them everything. Claire's shoulders relaxed slightly, like she'd been holding tension she hadn't realized was there. Thank you. And Mr. Brooks, Ethan, I really am sorry, not just for what happened, but for not paying attention sooner, for letting efficiency and profit margins matter more than people. That changes now. We'll see, Ethan said, but for the first time in days, he felt something that might have been hope. They talked for another hour, Claire explaining her plans for the board meeting, Ethan sharing the evidence he'd received from Miranda Chen. By the time they parted ways, Ethan had Claire's direct phone number, a check that would change his life, and something he'd thought he'd lost forever. A sense that maybe the system could work after all, if the right people cared enough to make it work. The board meeting that afternoon was exactly as brutal as Claire had anticipated. The conference room was packed, all 12 board members, the company's general counsel, the CFO, and the head of HR. Claire stood at the head of the table, the evidence spread before her, and made her case with methodical precision. She walked them through the financial records, the shipping manifests, the pattern of systematic theft. She presented testimony from Miranda Chen, who'd agreed to go on record despite her fears. She explained how Ethan Brooks had been eliminated specifically for threatening to expose the scheme, how his performance records had been falsified, how his loyalty had been rewarded with destruction. The board listened in increasingly uncomfortable silence. Some faces showed shock, others skepticism, a few carefully neutral. When she finished, the chairman, a 70-year-old named Harold Westbrook, who'd served on the board since Claire's grandfather ran the company, spoke first. This is deeply disturbing, Claire. If what you're saying is accurate, it represents not just fraud, but a systematic failure of our oversight responsibilities. He looked around the table. However, it also represents a public relations nightmare for this company. The stock price will tank the moment this becomes public. Investors will lose confidence. We could be looking at shareholder lawsuits, regulatory investigations, years of negative publicity. I understand that, Claire said. But the alternative is allowing criminals to escape accountability because it's inconvenient to pursue justice. It's not about convenience, another board member, a former senator named Patricia Reeves, interjected. It's about protecting the thousands of employees who depend on this company remaining solvent. If we pursue this aggressively, we could end up destroying the very people we're claiming to protect. If we don't pursue this, Claire countered, we're telling every employee that integrity doesn't matter, that reporting wrongdoing will get you fired while committing crimes gets you a golden parachute. Is that really the message we want to send? The debate raged for over an hour. Some board members sided with Claire immediately, horrified by the evidence and supportive of aggressive prosecution. Others argued for quiet resolution, suggesting that Kellerman and Preston be allowed to resign with minimal fanfare while the company worked behind the scenes to recover the stolen funds. Finally, Harold Westbrook called for a vote. All in favor of pursuing criminal charges against Robert Kellerman and James Preston, cooperating fully with law enforcement, and issuing a public statement about the fraud and Mr. Brooks's wrongful termination. 7 hands went up, including Claire's. All opposed? 5 hands rose. The motion carries, Westbrook said heavily. Claire, you have the board's support to proceed, but understand, this is your initiative. If it goes sideways, if the company suffers because of how this is handled, that falls on you. I understand, Claire said, and I accept that responsibility. After the meeting, as board members filed out in small clusters, Harold Westbrook approached Claire. "Your grandfather would be proud," he said quietly, "and terrified. You've just painted a target on your back, young lady. Kellerman and Preston won't go down quietly, and they have friends in places that matter. Watch your back." "I will. But I'd rather have a target on my back than compromise what this company should stand for." Westbrook smiled sadly. "Idealism is a luxury in this business. I hope you can afford to keep it." That evening, Claire issued a statement through the company's communications department. It was carefully worded by lawyers but clear in its essentials. Meridian Logistics had discovered evidence of systematic fraud by 2 senior executives. Criminal charges were being pursued, and an employee who'd been wrongfully terminated as a result of reporting irregularities was being reinstated with full compensation and a formal apology. The statement hit the industry like a bomb. Within hours, business news outlets were running stories. The stock price dropped 6% in after-hours trading. Competitors began circling, sensing opportunity in Meridian's moment of weakness. And somewhere in Seattle, Robert Kellerman and James Preston were meeting with their own attorneys, preparing their counterattack. But Claire had made her choice. Whatever came next, she would face it, knowing she'd chosen principle over expediency, justice over comfort. She just hoped it would be enough. Ethan stood outside St. Mary's shelter as evening settled over the city, his phone pressed to his ear, listening to Ava's excited voice telling him about her day at school. He'd deposited Claire's check, arranged for a new apartment they could move into in 3 days, and bought groceries, real groceries, not just whatever was cheapest. "And Mrs. Patterson said my essay was so good she's going to hang it on the wall," Ava was saying. "Can you believe it, Daddy?" "I can absolutely believe it," Ethan said, and for the first time in what felt like years, he wasn't lying when he told her everything would be okay. "You're brilliant, baby girl, just like I've always told you." "When are you coming back?" "Soon. I just have a few more things to take care of. Rebecca's with you, right?" "Yeah, she's teaching me to play Go Fish. She says I'm a natural card shark." Ethan smiled despite everything. "I'll be there in an hour. Love you, Ava." "Love you too, Daddy." After hanging up, Ethan stood watching the city lights flicker to life across the skyline. He thought about how quickly everything could change, how you could lose everything in a day, and maybe, just maybe, start to build it back almost as fast. He thought about Claire Montgomery, risking her career to do the right thing. He thought about Miranda Chen, gathering evidence despite her fear. He thought about all the people who'd made small choices that added up to something larger, a chance for justice, for accountability, for the system to actually work the way it was supposed to. It wasn't over. The fight with Kellerman and Preston would be long and ugly. There would be court dates, depositions, media attention. But for the first time since he'd been fired, Ethan felt like he was moving forward instead of just drowning. He pulled out his phone and texted Claire. "Thank you for believing me, for doing something about it, for caring enough to try." Her response came minutes later. "Thank you for not giving up, for keeping your integrity even when it cost you everything. We're going to fix this. Together." Ethan pocketed his phone and walked back into the shelter, ready to spend one more night in this place that represented his lowest point, knowing it would also mark the beginning of something better. The storm had broken. Now came the work of rebuilding from the ruins, one honest choice at a time. The news broke across every major business outlet by morning. Ethan woke to his phone buzzing incessantly with notifications, news alerts, messages from former colleagues he hadn't heard from in years, even a few calls from journalists who'd somehow gotten his number. He silenced the phone and looked across the shelter room to where Ava still slept, her face peaceful in the gray dawn light filtering through the high window. 3 more days. 3 more days in this place. And then they'd have a home again. Rebecca knocked softly on the doorframe, holding 2 cups of the shelter's terrible coffee. "You're famous," she said, slipping into the room and handing him one. "It's all over the news. Corporate fraud, whistleblower vindication, CEO taking on her own executives. They're calling you a hero." "I'm not a hero," Ethan said quietly, accepting the coffee. "I just noticed something was wrong and said something about it. That shouldn't be heroic. That should be normal." "Yeah, well, normal doesn't sell newspapers." Rebecca settled onto the edge of Ava's cot, careful not to wake her. "So what happens now?" I saw they're offering you your job back. Better than my job back. They're creating a new position, Director of Operations Integrity. Basically, my job will be to make sure what happened to me doesn't happen to anyone else. Ethan took a sip of coffee, grimacing at the bitterness. It pays almost twice what I was making before. Rebecca whistled softly. That's quite the promotion for a guy who was distributing packages last week. It's guilt money. Claire Montgomery trying to make things right. But even as he said it, Ethan knew it was more complicated than that. The conversations he'd had with Claire over the past 24 hours had revealed someone genuinely wrestling with her own complicity in a broken system, someone trying to figure out how to lead differently. You complaining? Rebecca asked with a slight smile. No, just trying to process it all. Last week I couldn't afford to feed my daughter. Now I'm being offered a six-figure salary and national news outlets are calling me for interviews. He looked at Rebecca, this woman who'd shown him kindness when he'd had nothing. What about you? What's your plan? Rebecca's smile faded. Same as always. Work at the diner, save what I can, hope something breaks my way eventually. She stood, collecting her coffee cup. But hey, at least I can tell people I knew you when you were nobody, right? After she left, Ethan sat in the pre-dawn quiet, thinking about all the people still trapped in situations like the one he was escaping. Rebecca and the dozens of other families in this shelter, caught in systems that made climbing out nearly impossible. His good fortune felt less like justice and more like random chance. He'd happened to notice fraud involving people powerful enough that exposing it made headlines. But what about everyone else who'd been fired unfairly by people without the resources or connections to fight back? The thought troubled him as he got Ava ready for school, as he walked her through streets that felt different now that news vans were occasionally visible near the shelter, reporters hoping to catch him for a comment. He'd been dodging them, following the advice of the attorney Claire had connected him with, but he knew eventually he'd have to face the cameras and microphones. At the school entrance, Ava turned to him with worried eyes. The other kids are going to know about us, aren't they? About the shelter? Maybe. Probably. Ethan knelt down to her level. But you know what? There's nothing shameful about needing help sometimes. A lot of families go through hard times. What matters is that we stuck together and now things are getting better. Some kids are mean about stuff like that. Some kids are mean about everything. That's not about you. That's about them. He kissed her forehead. You hold your head up, okay? You have nothing to be embarrassed about. She nodded, but the uncertainty didn't leave her eyes. Ethan watched her walk into the school, her purple sweater bright against the gray morning, and felt a fresh wave of anger at the system that had put that shame in his daughter's heart. His phone rang. Claire Montgomery's name appeared on the screen. Ethan, she said when he answered, her voice tense, we have a problem. Kellerman and Preston just filed a defamation lawsuit against both of us and the company. They're claiming the fraud allegations are fabricated, that they're being scapegoated for legitimate business decisions, and that we've destroyed their reputations without cause. Ethan felt his stomach drop. Can they do that? We have evidence. They can file anything they want. Whether they can win is another question, but the process itself is damaging. They're also giving interviews. There's going to be a segment on the Business News Channel at noon where they present their side. Claire paused. I need to ask you something, and I need you to be honest. Is there anything in your past they could use against you? Any performance issues, disciplinary actions, anything they might twist to undermine your credibility? No. I was a good employee. You saw my reviews. I know what the official record says. But is there anything unofficial? Conflicts with coworkers, mistakes that weren't documented, anything they could dig up and weaponize? Ethan thought hard, running through 9 years of employment. There was one incident, maybe 5 years ago. A coworker accused me of taking credit for his idea in a team meeting. It got heated, but management investigated and cleared me. The guy eventually admitted he'd misunderstood what I'd said. Is that the kind of thing they'd use? Probably. They'll paint you as someone with a history of causing problems, someone who might fabricate accusations out of spite. Claire's voice was grim. I'm sorry. I know this is exactly what you were afraid of. What do we do? We fight back. I'm scheduling a press conference for this afternoon. I'm going to present the evidence publicly, answer questions, and make it clear that this isn't about personal grudges. It's about documented fraud. I'd like you to be there with me, but I understand if you don't want to expose yourself to that kind of scrutiny." Ethan closed his eyes, thinking about Ava, about the stability he'd just started to rebuild, about how much easier it would be to take the money Claire had offered and disappear from public view. Let the lawyers handle the legal battle while he focused on creating a normal life for his daughter. But then he thought about Miranda Chen, who'd risked her job to give him evidence. He thought about all the other Ethan Brooks out there, people who'd notice wrongdoing and stay silent because speaking up was too dangerous. He thought about what kind of example he wanted to set for Ava, that you stood up for what was right even when it was hard, or that you took the easy path when confronted with power. "I'll be there," he said. "What time?" The press conference was scheduled for 2 p.m. in the lobby of Meridian's headquarters. Claire had arranged for a car to pick up Ethan from the shelter, and he'd spent the intervening hours with the company's legal team preparing for the kinds of questions he might face. They'd coached him on staying calm, sticking to facts, not letting emotion undermine his credibility. "They're going to try to rattle you," the lead attorney warned. "They'll ask about your financial situation, imply you're motivated by money. They'll bring up any mistakes you've ever made. Your job is to stay composed and tell the truth simply." "I can do that," Ethan said, though his hands were shaking. The car that arrived to take him to headquarters was nicer than any vehicle Ethan had ever been in. Leather seats, a driver in a suit, bottles of water in a console. He felt absurdly out of place in his discount store clothes, carrying his worn backpack, but the driver treated him with quiet respect. "Ms. Montgomery speaks very highly of you, sir," the driver said as they pulled into traffic. "Says you're exactly the kind of person the company needs." Ethan wasn't sure how to respond to that, so he just nodded and stared out the window at the city passing by. He'd traveled these same streets for years, going to and from a job he'd been good at, never imagining he'd end up at the center of a corporate scandal. Meridian's headquarters looked different in daylight, imposing and modern, with its glass facade reflecting the cloudy sky. A cluster of news vans was already parked outside, reporters and camera operators setting up equipment. Ethan felt his anxiety spike. Inside, Claire was waiting in a conference room with her legal team and a communications specialist who was briefing her on message points. She looked up when Ethan entered, and he saw the same tension in her face that he felt in his own chest. "Thank you for coming," she said, standing to shake his hand. The gesture felt formal, professional, like they were establishing roles for the cameras, rather than acknowledging the strange alliance they'd formed. "I know this isn't easy." "Neither is living in a shelter," Ethan said. "If this helps prevent that from happening to other people, it's worth it." The communications specialist, a sharp-eyed woman named Jennifer, stepped forward. "Mr. Brooks, I need to be direct with you. The opposition is going to try to make you look like a disgruntled employee with a grudge. They've already leaked information about your eviction, your time in the shelter. They're creating a narrative that you're financially desperate and willing to say anything for a payout. That's not true. I know. But truth and narrative aren't always the same thing in the court of public opinion. Your best defense is to be authentic. Don't try to sound corporate or polished. Just be yourself, a father who lost everything for doing the right thing and is now trying to rebuild." Jennifer consulted her tablet. "And if they ask about the money Ms. Montgomery offered you, be honest about it. Don't hide it or minimize it. Own it. You deserve that compensation." At 2 p.m., they walked down to the lobby, which had been set up with a podium, microphones, and rows of chairs filled with journalists. Cameras lined the back wall. Ethan stood off to the side while Claire approached the podium, her expression composed but serious. "Thank you all for coming," Claire began, her voice steady and clear. "I'm here today to address allegations that have been made by former Meridian executives Robert Kellerman and James Preston, and to present evidence of systematic fraud that has taken place within this company over the past 2 years." She spoke for 15 minutes, methodically laying out the evidence, explaining the shipping discrepancies, the shell companies, the missing inventory. She presented financial records on screens behind her, showing the pattern of theft with clinical precision. And then she turned to Ethan. This man, Ethan Brooks, was a loyal employee of Meridian Logistics for 9 years. His performance reviews were exemplary. He noticed irregularities in our distribution system and reported them through proper channels, exactly as our company policies instruct employees to do. For that act of integrity, he was fired, His reputation was destroyed, and his life was thrown into chaos. Claire's voice hardened. That is unacceptable. It represents everything that is wrong with corporate culture that prioritizes protecting the powerful over supporting those who stand up for what's right. She gestured for Ethan to join her at the podium. His legs felt unsteady as he walked forward, but he focused on putting one foot in front of the other, on keeping his expression calm. Mr. Brooks has agreed to take questions, Claire said, but I want to be clear. He is the victim in this situation, not the accused. The scrutiny should be on the men who stole millions of dollars and destroyed lives to cover their tracks, not on the person who exposed them. The questions came fast, shouted from multiple reporters at once. Claire pointed to a woman in the front row. Mr. Brooks, Robert Kellerman's attorney says you had multiple performance issues and were terminated for cause. How do you respond to that? Ethan leaned toward the microphone. That's not true. I have copies of my performance reviews, all of which rate my work as satisfactory or exceeds expectations. The only negative note in my file came 3 weeks before I was fired, after I reported the inventory discrepancies. That's not coincidence. That's retaliation. Another reporter. You're currently homeless, is that correct? Couldn't this just be about getting money from the company? The question stung, but Ethan had been prepared for it. Yes, I was evicted after losing my job. My daughter and I have been staying at a family shelter. And yes, Ms. Montgomery has offered me compensation. Compensation I deserve after being wrongfully terminated and having my reputation destroyed. But I had evidence of fraud before any money was offered. This isn't about a payout. It's about holding people accountable for crimes. A male reporter near the back. Why should we believe you over two executives with decades of experience and spotless reputations? Because I have documentation, Ethan said simply. Shipping manifests, inventory reports, financial records. This isn't he said, she said. This is numbers and dates and patterns of theft that anyone can verify if they look at the evidence. Claire stepped back to the microphone. And that evidence has been turned over to law enforcement. The FBI's white-collar crime division is now investigating. This isn't just internal company politics. These are federal crimes. The questions continued for another 20 minutes, some hostile, some sympathetic, all intense. Ethan answered as honestly as he could, feeling his shirt stick to his back with nervous sweat, but never losing his composure. When Claire finally ended the conference, he felt like he'd run a marathon. Backstage, away from the cameras, Jennifer approached them with her tablet. Initial social media response is running about 60-40 in your favor. The raw emotion worked. People are connecting with Mr. Brooks's story. But there's also a lot of skepticism, people saying he's just after money, that this is a scheme to extort the company. Let them be skeptical, Claire said. The evidence speaks for itself. Once the investigation is complete, the truth will be undeniable. But Ethan knew it wasn't that simple. In his experience, truth didn't always win out over narrative, and powerful people had resources to shape narrative however they wanted. Still, he'd done what he could. The rest was out of his hands. His phone rang. Ava's school. His heart jumped. It was the middle of the afternoon. They shouldn't be calling unless something was wrong. Mr. Brooks, this is Principal Harrison. I wanted to let you know that Ava got into an altercation with another student. She's fine, but we need you to come pick her up. An altercation? Ava's never been in trouble before. What happened? Another child made some unkind comments about your family's living situation. Ava pushed him. As I said, she's not hurt, but we have a zero-tolerance policy for physical confrontation. She'll need to serve a 1-day suspension. Ethan closed his eyes, feeling his brief moment of triumph curdle into something darker. His 7-year-old daughter was fighting at school because of choices he'd made, because he'd insisted on doing the right thing even though it had cost them everything. I'll be there in 20 minutes, he said. Claire, overhearing the conversation, immediately offered her car and driver. Ethan accepted, too worried about Ava to refuse out of pride. The drive to the school felt endless, his mind spinning with guilt and anger and helplessness. He found Ava sitting in the principal's office, her face blotchy from crying, her purple sweater torn at the shoulder. She looked up when he entered, and the devastation in her eyes broke his heart. I'm sorry, Daddy, she said immediately. I didn't mean to push him. He just kept saying mean things about us living in a shelter, and I told him to stop, and he wouldn't stop, and I just... Ethan pulled her into his arms, holding her tight, while she sobbed against his chest. Over her head, he met Principal Harrison's eyes. What exactly did the other child say? The principal looked uncomfortable. From what I understand, he called Ava homeless and said her father was a liar who got fired for being bad at his job. His parents saw the news coverage this morning and apparently discussed it at breakfast. And what consequences is he facing for bullying my daughter? We'll be having a conversation with his parents about appropriate behavior. But Ava did initiate a physical contact. She's 7 years old, and she was defending herself from verbal assault, Ethan said, his voice harder than he'd intended. I understand you have policies, but I want it on record that my daughter was provoked and that this school failed to protect her from harassment. After signing the necessary paperwork for Ava's suspension, Ethan led her out to the waiting car. She was silent during the ride back to the shelter, staring out the window with swollen eyes. I'm sorry I got in trouble, she finally said, her voice small. You don't need to apologize, baby. That boy had no right to say those things to you. Ethan took her hand. But pushing people isn't how we solve problems, even when they're being cruel. I know, but I was so mad, Daddy. He said you were lying and that we deserved to be homeless, and I just wanted him to stop. I know, and I'm proud of you for defending us, even if the method wasn't ideal. He squeezed her hand. But here's the thing. People are going to say a lot of things about us in the next few weeks. Some of it will be true, some won't be. Some people will understand why we did what we did, and others will think we're wrong. We can't control what they think or say. We can only control how we respond. How do we respond? We keep our heads up, we know the truth, and we keep moving forward. Ethan managed a smile. And in 3 days, we're moving into our own apartment. No more shelter. Just you and me in our own space again. That got the first hint of a smile from her. Really? Really. I signed the lease this morning. 2 bedrooms, so you'll have your own room. There's even a park nearby. Can we get a cat? The question was so normal, so wonderfully mundane, that Ethan felt tears prick his eyes. Maybe. Let's get settled first, but we can talk about it. That evening, after Ava was asleep, Ethan stood outside the shelter smoking a cigarette he'd bummed from another resident. He'd quit smoking years ago, but tonight he needed something to do with his hands, some way to process the chaos of the day. Rebecca found him there, her shift at the diner finished, her feet aching in worn sneakers. Saw the press conference, she said, leaning against the wall beside him. You did good. Looked almost human on camera. My daughter got suspended from school today because some kid repeated things his parents said about us at breakfast. She pushed him. Ethan took a drag of the cigarette, coughing slightly. She's 7 years old and already learning that standing up for yourself comes with consequences. Better she learns it now from you than later from the world, Rebecca said. At least you're teaching her to fight back instead of just taking it. Is that what I'm teaching her? Or am I teaching her that doing the right thing means losing everything that matters? You didn't lose everything. You lost a job and an apartment. You still have her and she still has you. That's not nothing. Rebecca pulled out her own cigarette, lighting it with practiced ease. You know what I tell my kids? I tell them that we might not have much, but we have each other, and no one can take that away unless we let them. Sounds like bullshit, I know, but it's also true. Ethan looked at her, this woman who'd been living in survival mode for years, who'd shown him kindness when he'd needed it most. Thank you for everything. When we move out, I want to help you. I'm going to be making good money, and don't, Rebecca interrupted gently. Don't make promises you might not be able to keep. Get yourself stable first. Make sure your daughter has what she needs. Then, if you still want to help, we'll talk. But right now, focus on your own family. They stood in comfortable silence, watching the shelter's lights reflect off the wet pavement. Tomorrow would bring more challenges, more scrutiny, more people judging choices Ethan had made from positions of safety they'd never had to leave. But tonight, he had a place to sleep, a daughter who trusted him, and the knowledge that at least some people believed he'd done the right thing. It wasn't enough. It wasn't justice, not really. But it was more than he'd had a week ago, and sometimes survival meant being grateful for incremental progress instead of demanding immediate vindication. 3 days later, Ethan and Ava moved into their new apartment. It was nothing fancy, a 2-bedroom unit in a complex that had seen better days, with carpet that was slightly worn and appliances that were functional rather than modern. But it had space for Ava's books, a kitchen where Ethan could cook real meals, and most importantly, it was theirs. Ava ran from room to room, her excitement infectious, planning where her bed would go and what color she wanted to paint her walls. Ethan stood in the living room, surrounded by the few boxes containing everything they owned, and felt something close to peace. His phone buzzed, a text from Claire. FBI raided Kellerman's house this morning. They found offshore accounts and evidence of additional fraud dating back 5 years. You were right about all of it. Ethan read the message twice, letting it sink in. Vindication felt different than he'd expected. Less triumphant, more weary. He was glad the truth was coming out, glad that Kellerman and Preston would face real consequences. But it didn't undo the past weeks, didn't erase what Ava had been through, didn't restore the innocence she'd lost. He texted back, "Good. Thank you for believing me." Claire's response was immediate. "Thank you for not giving up. Come by the office Monday. We need to get you officially onboarded in your new position." Monday felt impossibly far away and also too soon. Ethan would be walking back into Meridian not as the invisible distribution coordinator, but as someone with authority, with a voice, with the power to make sure what happened to him didn't happen to others. It was terrifying and necessary in equal measure. "Daddy," Ava called from her new bedroom, "come see where I want my bookshelf." Ethan pocketed his phone and went to help his daughter build her new life, one small decision at a time. The apartment wasn't much, but it was theirs. The job wasn't perfect, but it was meaningful. The future wasn't certain, but it was possible again. And sometimes, after losing everything, possible was more than enough. It was a gift, hard-won and precious, earned through integrity that had cost him dearly, but that he'd never have to question or regret. Outside, the city continued its indifferent rhythm, full of people struggling and surviving and occasionally winning small battles against systems designed to grind them down. Ethan was one of them now, not a hero, not a victim, just a man who'd noticed something wrong and refused to pretend he hadn't seen it. That refusal had nearly destroyed him, but it had also saved him in ways he was only beginning to understand. Monday morning arrived with unexpected sunshine, the kind of clear autumn day that made Seattle feel almost optimistic. Ethan stood in front of the bathroom mirror in his new apartment, adjusting the tie he'd bought specifically for this occasion. It was the first new piece of clothing he'd purchased in months, and the act of buying it, walking into a store with money in his account, choosing something of quality rather than necessity, had felt surreal. Ava appeared in the doorway, already dressed for school in jeans and a fresh t-shirt, her hair in the ponytail she'd learned to do herself during their weeks in the shelter. "You look fancy, Daddy," she said, eyeing the tie with appreciation. "Trying to make a good impression on my first day back." Ethan turned to face her, spreading his arms. "How do I look?" "Like someone important." The words hit him harder than she could have known. For weeks he'd felt invisible, erased, a problem to be managed rather than a person who mattered. Now he was walking back into Meridian, not just as an employee, but as someone with actual authority, with a mandate to change how the company treated its people. The responsibility of that felt enormous. They ate breakfast together, actual breakfast, eggs and toast and orange juice, not the gray scrambled offerings of the shelter cafeteria. Small luxuries that Ethan was learning not to take for granted. Afterward, he walked Ava to school, the same route they'd traveled during the worst days, but transformed now by the knowledge that they had a home to return to. At the school entrance, Ava hesitated, the memory of her suspension still fresh. "What if kids are still mean about the shelter?" she asked quietly. Ethan knelt down to her level, taking both her hands. "Then you remember that their meanness says something about them, not about you. We went through something hard, and we came out the other side. There's no shame in that. There's only strength. You promise?" "I promise. And if anyone gives you trouble, you tell Mrs. Patterson, and then you tell me. We handle things the right way now. We have people who listen." He kissed her forehead. "I love you, baby girl. Have a good day." "Love you too, Daddy." He watched her walk through the doors, her backpack bouncing against her shoulders, and sent a silent prayer to whatever forces governed the universe that she'd find kindness today instead of cruelty. The drive to Meridian headquarters took 20 minutes through morning traffic. Ethan had his old Honda back, Claire had arranged to have it retrieved from the impound lot where it had been towed after too many nights parked illegally. The car needed work, made concerning noises when he accelerated, but it ran, and it was his. Another small piece of his life restored. The security guard at Meridian's entrance recognized him from the news coverage and waved him through with something that looked like respect. Inside, the lobby felt different than it had during his years as an invisible distribution coordinator. People looked at him now, some with curiosity, others with the wariness you'd show someone who'd exposed corruption in the ranks. He was both hero and threat, depending on who was judging. Claire's assistant met him at the elevator bank. Ms. Montgomery is waiting in her office. She wanted to greet you personally before we start the onboarding process. The executive floor was as intimidating as Ethan remembered from his single previous visit, when he'd been escorted out with a box of his belongings and his life in ruins. Now he walked these halls as someone who belonged, and the cognitive dissonance was dizzying. Claire's office overlooked the city, floor-to-ceiling windows framing the skyline like a painting. She stood when he entered, coming around her desk to shake his hand with genuine warmth. "Ethan, welcome back." She gestured to the sitting area by the windows. "How are you settling into the new apartment?" "Still getting used to having space again. Ava's excited about her own bedroom." Ethan sat in a chair that probably cost more than his monthly rent used to be. "Thank you for making it possible." "You earned it, and honestly, it's the bare minimum of what we owe you." Claire settled into the chair across from him, her expression serious. "Before we start the official day, I want to talk to you about what this role actually means. Director of Operations Integrity sounds impressive, but I need you to understand what I'm asking you to do. Make sure people don't get fired for reporting problems. That's part of it, but it's bigger than that." Claire leaned forward, her intensity palpable. "What happened to you exposed a fundamental rot in how we operate. We created a culture where people were afraid to speak up, where loyalty to the company meant staying silent about wrongdoing, where efficiency mattered more than ethics. Your job is to change that culture from the inside." "That's a tall order for one person." "You won't be alone. I'm restructuring the entire oversight system. You'll have a team, direct access to me and the board, and the authority to investigate any concerns that come to your attention." Claire's voice was firm. "But I won't lie to you. There are people in this company who resent what you represent. People who think you're a troublemaker who got lucky, who see your presence as a threat to how they've always done business. You're going to face resistance." "I've faced worse," Ethan said quietly. "I know. And that's exactly why you're the right person for this role." Claire stood, walking to her desk and picking up a folder. "The FBI's investigation has expanded beyond Kellerman and Preston. They've uncovered a network of corruption that touches multiple departments, stretches back nearly a decade. Some of the people implicated are still working here, still in positions of authority. We'll be making more terminations over the coming weeks." "How bad is it?" "Bad enough that our stock price has dropped 18%, and we're facing multiple class action lawsuits from investors who claim we misrepresented our financial health." Claire's expression was grim. "Bad enough that I've had 3 board members suggest I resign to restore confidence. Bad enough that my grandfather called last night to tell me he's proud of me but worried I've destroyed the company in the process of trying to save it." Ethan absorbed this, understanding for the first time the full scope of what Claire had risked by choosing to expose the fraud rather than quietly resolving it. She hadn't just believed him. She'd put her entire career on the line for a principle that most executives would have sacrificed for expedience. "Why did you do it?" he asked. "Really? You could have paid me off, let Kellerman and Preston resign quietly, and moved on with minimal damage to yourself or the company." Claire was quiet for a long moment, staring out at the city below. When she spoke, her voice carried a weight that suggested she'd been wrestling with the same question. "Because I looked at what we'd done to you and realized that if I let it stand, I'd be complicit in a system that devours honest people to protect dishonest ones. And I couldn't live with that." She turned back to him. "My grandfather built this company on the belief that how you treat people matters more than quarterly profits. Somewhere along the way, we forgot that. I forgot that. But you reminded me, and I'm grateful for it, even though it's been hell." The honesty of her admission created a moment of understanding between them. 2 people from vastly different circumstances who'd both been transformed by choosing integrity over comfort. So what happens now? Ethan asked. Ethan, now we rebuild. Together. Claire smiled, and for the first time since he'd met her, it reached her eyes. Come on, let me introduce you to your team. The morning passed in a blur of meetings and introductions. Ethan's team consisted of 4 people, 2 former HR professionals, an attorney specializing in employment law, and a data analyst who'd be responsible for monitoring the kinds of discrepancies Ethan had originally noticed. They were smart, committed, and clearly nervous about working for someone who'd been homeless 3 weeks ago. I know this is unusual, Ethan told them during their first team meeting. I'm not a typical executive. I don't have an MBA or decades of corporate experience. What I have is personal knowledge of what happens when systems fail the people they're supposed to protect. My job, our job, is to make sure that doesn't keep happening. Sarah Chen, one of the HR professionals, spoke up. What kind of authority do we actually have? Because I've worked in compliance before, and usually it's a lot of reporting problems up the chain and watching nothing change. That's not how this works, Ethan said firmly. We report directly to Claire and the board. Any concerns we flag get investigated immediately, and we have the power to halt operations if we identify potential harm to employees. This isn't window dressing. This is a fundamental restructuring of how Meridian operates. He could see the skepticism in their faces, the learned wariness of people who'd seen too many corporate reform initiatives dissolve into meaningless policy documents. Winning their trust would take time and consistent action, not just words. By lunch, Ethan's head was spinning with information about organizational structures, reporting protocols, and legal frameworks. He'd been given an office on the 10th floor, modest by executive standards but luxurious compared to the cubicle he'd occupied before. It had a door that closed, a window with an actual view, and furniture that didn't wobble when you leaned on it. He was eating a sandwich at his new desk when his phone rang. A number he didn't recognize, but he answered anyway. Mr. Brooks, this is Detective Sarah Martinez with the FBI's White-Collar Crime Division. I'm calling to update you on the investigation into Robert Kellerman and James Preston. Ethan set down his sandwich. What's the update? We've secured indictments against both men on multiple counts of wire fraud, embezzlement, and conspiracy. The evidence you and Ms. Chen provided was instrumental in building our case. We're also investigating several other individuals who may have been complicit in the scheme. Martinez paused. I wanted you to know that your decision to come forward, despite the personal cost, has potentially prevented millions in additional theft and will result in real accountability. When's the trial? Likely not for another year. These cases take time to build properly. You may be called to testify, and I won't sugarcoat it. Their defense attorneys will try to discredit you. They'll bring up your financial situation, suggest you're motivated by revenge or greed. Let them try, Ethan said. I've already lived through the worst they can do to me. I'm not afraid of telling the truth in court. After hanging up, Ethan sat quietly in his office, trying to process the strange reality of his new life. A year ago, he'd been a mid-level employee worried about making rent and saving for Ava's future. Now he was at the center of a federal investigation, working in a role designed to prevent the exact kind of corruption that had nearly destroyed him. The universe had a strange sense of narrative symmetry. His phone buzzed with a text from Claire. Board meeting in 20, conference room A. They want to meet you. Ethan's stomach tightened. The board, the people who'd ultimately approved the restructuring that had cost him his job, who were now deciding whether Claire's approach to the scandal would save or sink the company. Meeting them felt like walking into the lion's den. Conference room A was even more intimidating than Claire's office. A massive table, leather chairs, abstract art that probably cost more than Ethan's entire compensation package. The board members were already assembled, 12 people representing various corners of wealth and power. Harold Westbrook, the chairman, sat at the head of the table, his expression unreadable. Claire was already there, standing near a presentation screen. She caught Ethan's eye and gave him a small nod of encouragement. Ladies and gentlemen, Westbrook said, this is Ethan Brooks, our new Director of Operations Integrity. I thought it would be valuable for you to meet the man whose experience has prompted such significant changes in how we conduct business. Ethan felt the weight of their scrutiny, some curious, some skeptical, a few openly hostile. He remained standing, unsure of the protocol. Mr. Brooks, a woman Ethan recognized as Patricia Reeves, spoke up. I've reviewed your case file and Ms. Montgomery's recommendations for systemic changes. I have to ask, do you believe you're qualified to oversee operations integrity for a company of this size? Your background is in distribution, not compliance or ethics. The question was pointed but fair. Ethan took a breath before responding. No, I'm not traditionally qualified. I don't have the credentials you'd normally expect for this role. What I have is first-hand experience with what happens when oversight fails, and people who notice problems are punished instead of protected. He met Reeves's eyes directly. I know what it feels like to lose everything for doing what company policy says employees should do. That perspective is valuable because it keeps the human cost of our decisions front and center, not abstracted into statistics and reports. Another board member, a silver-haired man named Thomas Brennan, leaned forward. Ms. Montgomery has committed significant resources to this integrity initiative, money that could be returned to shareholders or invested in growth. From your perspective, is this really necessary, or are we overreacting to an isolated incident? It wasn't isolated, Ethan said firmly. The fraud that got me fired had been going on for years. People knew or suspected, but the culture made it too dangerous to speak up. If we don't change that culture fundamentally, we're just waiting for the next scandal. He glanced at Claire, who nodded encouragement. And with respect, sir, the cost of not changing is higher than the cost of reform. We're already facing lawsuits, federal investigations, and reputation damage. Investing in genuine oversight now is cheaper than dealing with another crisis later. The room was silent for a moment. Then Westbrook spoke, and there was something almost amused in his voice. You're more diplomatic than I expected, Mr. Brooks. For someone who's been through what you have, you could be forgiven for coming in here with an axe to grind. I'm not interested in grinding axes, Ethan said. I'm interested in making sure other people don't have to go through what my daughter and I went through. That's not about revenge. It's about prevention. The rest of the meeting focused on Claire's restructuring plans, but Ethan noticed that the board's questions to him were slightly less hostile than they'd been initially. He'd passed some tests, proven he wasn't just a victim looking for vengeance, but someone who understood the broader implications of what he'd experienced. After the meeting, Westbrook pulled him aside. My granddaughter, well, she's not technically my granddaughter, but I've known Claire since she was born. She's taking a hell of a risk supporting you and this initiative. The old guard on this board thinks she's destroying the company with idealism. Westbrook's expression was serious. I think she's saving it, but she needs wins, Mr. Brooks. She needs to prove that doing the right thing doesn't have to mean sacrificing profitability. Can you help her do that? I'm going to try, Ethan said honestly. That's all any of us can do. Westbrook patted his shoulder. Welcome to the fight. The weeks that followed established a new rhythm to Ethan's life. Mornings were for getting Ava ready for school, sharing breakfast in their apartment that was slowly becoming home. Days were spent at Meridian, building systems for reporting concerns, investigating complaints, and gradually earning the trust of employees who'd learned to stay silent about problems. Evenings were for homework help and dinner with Ava, for the small rituals of normal life that had been stripped away during their time in the shelter. Slowly, carefully, Ethan was building something stable. Not perfect. Stability never was. But real and earned. He made a point of staying in touch with Rebecca, meeting her for coffee every other week and quietly helping with her rent when she fell short. She protested the first time, but Ethan insisted. You helped me when I had nothing, he said. Let me do the same for you now that I can. This doesn't make us even, Rebecca warned. You're going to keep trying to help, and I'm going to keep feeling weird about it. I can live with that. Through Rebecca, Ethan learned about other families at the shelter, other people trapped in the same impossible circumstances he'd escaped. He started making anonymous donations to St. Mary's, funding repairs and supplies, remembering how much small improvements had mattered during his stay. Claire, when she learned about it, matched his donations and then exceeded them, turning it into a company initiative. If we're claiming to care about people, she said, we should put money where our mission statement is. By December, the investigation into Kellerman and Preston had expanded to implicate 6 other executives and middle managers who'd either participated in the fraud or known about it and stayed silent. The purge was painful. More terminations, more lawsuits, more negative press coverage. Meridian's stock price continued to fluctuate wildly, and Claire faced mounting pressure from shareholders who wanted quick fixes and easy answers. But she held firm, and Ethan stood beside her. The trial was scheduled for the following spring, but the evidence was so overwhelming that Kellerman and Preston's attorneys were already negotiating plea deals. They'd face prison time, financial penalties, and the permanent destruction of their reputations. It wasn't everything Ethan wanted, but it was justice. Imperfect, but real. On a Friday afternoon in mid-December, Ethan was reviewing incident reports when Claire appeared in his doorway. "Got a minute?" she asked. "Always. What's up?" She entered his office, closing the door behind her. "I wanted to tell you before it becomes public. The board met this morning. They voted to approve a major expansion of the Integrity Division. More staff, more resources, more authority to investigate and implement changes." That's good news, right? It's great news. It means they believe in what we're doing, that we're making a real difference. Claire sat across from his desk. But it's also happening because the FBI investigation is wrapping up, and the initial findings show that companies with robust integrity oversight are significantly less likely to face the kind of fraud we dealt with. We're becoming the case study for how to handle corporate corruption correctly. So we're succeeding? We're surviving, and in the process, we're building something better. Claire smiled. "I wanted to thank you for not giving up when it would have been easier, for trusting me enough to stand beside me through this, for reminding me what leadership is supposed to look like." "You did the hard part," Ethan said. "You chose accountability over self-preservation. That's rare." "It shouldn't be rare. That's the problem." Claire stood. "Anyway, I won't keep you. I know you pick up Ava from her after-school program on Fridays. I just wanted you to hear the news from me first." After she left, Ethan sat at his desk for a few minutes, absorbing the strange reality that he'd somehow become a symbol of corporate reform, that his personal nightmare had transformed into a movement for change. It felt both meaningful and insufficient, one victory in a system that still crushed too many people who didn't have his luck or Claire's support. But it was something. And something, Ethan was learning, was how you built toward everything. He picked up Ava from her after-school program and took her to dinner at a local diner. Nothing fancy, but a place where they could sit together and talk about her day without the shelter's chaos or the apartment's lingering unfamiliarity. "Madison invited me to her birthday party," Ava said, working through a plate of chicken fingers. "It's next Saturday. Can I go?" "Of course you can go. Do we need to buy a present?" "Probably. She likes art stuff. Maybe colored pencils or something?" Ava paused, then said more quietly, "I told her about the shelter, about what happened to us." Ethan felt his chest tighten. "What did she say?" "She said her uncle lost his job last year, and they had to help him for a while. She said it's not weird that sometimes families go through hard stuff." Ava looked up at him, her eyes serious. "She's nice, Daddy. Not everyone was mean about it." "No, baby. Not everyone is mean. Sometimes people surprise you with kindness." Ethan reached across to squeeze her hand. "I'm glad you have a friend like Madison." "Me too." They finished dinner and drove home through streets decorated with holiday lights, the city transformed into something magical by the approaching season. Their apartment complex had a small tree in the lobby, decorated by residents. It wasn't much, but it represented community, stability, the ordinary miracles of having a place that was yours. That night, after Ava was asleep, Ethan stood at his living room window, looking out at the city lights and thinking about the strange journey that had brought him here. 6 months ago, he'd been sitting in the same city, rain pouring down, homeless with his daughter, and no idea how they'd survive. Now he had a home, a job that mattered, and the beginnings of a life rebuilt from ruins. It wasn't the life he'd planned. It was better in some ways, harder in others, marked by losses that would never fully heal. But it was his, earned through refusal to stay silent, through Claire's choice to believe him, through 1,000 small decisions to keep moving forward when giving up would have been easier. His phone buzzed. A text from Claire. Legal called. Kellerman and Preston accepted plea deals. 8 years each, full restitution, cooperation with ongoing investigations. It's over. Ethan read the message twice, waiting to feel triumph or satisfaction or relief. Instead, he felt something quieter, a sense of completion, of a chapter closing so a new one could begin. He texted back, "Good. Thank you for everything." Her response? "Thank you for believing the system could work if someone cared enough to make it work. You changed this company. You changed me." Ethan pocketed his phone and returned to the window, to the city full of people fighting their own battles against systems designed to defeat them. He couldn't save them all. He couldn't fix every injustice or prevent every casualty of corporate indifference. But he could make sure that at Meridian, at least, people who noticed wrongdoing wouldn't be punished for speaking up. He could create a space where integrity was valued over loyalty, where doing the right thing didn't cost you everything. It was a small change in a vast system. But small changes, accumulated over time, performed by people who refused to accept that cruelty was inevitable, could transform everything. 3 months later, on a Saturday morning in early March, Ethan and Ava stood in the local animal shelter, looking at cats available for adoption. They'd talked about it for weeks, debated breeds and personalities, saved money for supplies and vet visits. Ava had fallen in love with a gray tabby who'd been surrendered when her previous owner lost their housing. The cat was 3 years old, cautious but affectionate once she trusted you, content to purr in your lap for hours. "Her name is Luna," Ava said, reading the card on the cage. "Can we adopt her, Daddy, please?" Ethan looked at the cat, at his daughter's hopeful face, at the volunteer waiting patiently for their decision. He thought about how far they'd come from that night in the car, rain pounding the windshield while they'd had nowhere to go. He thought about all the small victories that had accumulated into this moment, having a home stable enough for a pet, having income reliable enough to afford one, having hearts healed enough to open them to something new. "Yeah, baby," he said, his voice thick with emotion he didn't bother hiding. "We can adopt her." The process took about an hour. Paperwork, payment, instructions for care. By early afternoon, they were walking into their apartment with Luna in a carrier, Ava chattering excitedly about where they'd put the litter box and what games they'd play. Ethan set up the cat supplies while Ava sat on the floor, letting Luna explore her new home cautiously. The cat moved from room to room, sniffing corners, testing furniture, gradually relaxing as she realized she was safe. She was homeless too, Ava observed, watching Luna settle onto the couch. "But now she has us. Now she's home." "Yeah," Ethan said softly. "Now she's home." His phone rang. Claire Montgomery, calling on a Saturday, which was unusual. "Ethan, sorry to bother you on the weekend. I wanted to let you know, the board met yesterday for final numbers on Q1. We're up 14% over projections. The Integrity Initiative is actually improving efficiency because people feel safe reporting problems early instead of letting them compound." Her voice carried barely contained excitement. "We're proving that doing right by people and doing right by the business aren't mutually exclusive. We're changing the model." "That's incredible," Ethan said, genuinely pleased. "It's because of the systems you built, the culture you're creating." Claire paused. "There's something else. I've been asked to speak at the National Business Ethics Conference about our approach to corporate reform. I'd like you to come with me, to tell your story from the employee perspective. I know public speaking isn't your thing, but—" "I'll do it," Ethan interrupted. "If there's a chance our experience can help other companies treat their people better, I'll do it." "Thank you. It's in June, in Chicago. We'll cover all expenses, of course." After hanging up, Ethan returned to the living room where Ava had successfully coaxed Luna onto her lap. The cat was purring loudly, her eyes half closed in contentment. "Who was that?" Ava asked. "Claire. She wants me to give a speech about what happened to us." "Are you going to talk about the shelter?" "Probably. Is that okay with you?" Ava considered this seriously. "I think it's okay. Maybe if people hear about it, they'll be nicer to other families who go through hard times. Maybe they'll make rules that protect people instead of just protecting companies." At 7 years old, his daughter understood what so many adults refused to see, that systems were choices, that cruelty was optional, that how we treat people who have nothing was a measure of who we really were. "You're pretty wise for a kid," Ethan said. "I learned from you," Ava replied simply, returning her attention to Luna. That evening, after Ava was in bed and Luna had claimed her spot at the foot of the couch, Ethan sat in his living room with a cup of coffee and a sense of quiet accomplishment. The apartment wasn't luxurious. The furniture was secondhand. The cat was a rescue who'd known hardship. But it was theirs, built from wreckage through determination and luck and the choice to keep believing that integrity mattered even when it seemed like it didn't. He thought about Robert Kellerman and James Preston, beginning their prison sentences, their reputations destroyed, their comfortable lives dismantled. He didn't feel satisfaction at their punishment so much as a sense of rightness. Actions had consequences, power couldn't protect you forever, and sometimes the system actually worked the way it was supposed to. He thought about Claire Montgomery, who'd risked everything to choose accountability over convenience, who'd learned that leadership meant more than profit margins and efficiency reports. She'd become something unexpected through this experience, not just a competent executive, but someone who understood that how you treated people defined who you were. And he thought about himself, about the man who'd sat in a car with his daughter and nothing else, believing his life was over. That man had been broken but not defeated, desperate but not hopeless. That man had fought back the only way he knew how, with honesty, with documentation, with refusal to let his destruction be invisible. That man had won, in the ways that mattered. Ethan picked up his phone and opened his email, scrolling through messages from journalists requesting interviews, from employees at other companies asking for advice on reporting wrongdoing, from advocacy groups wanting to partner on corporate reform initiatives. His experience had become something larger than himself, a symbol of what was possible when people chose courage over silence. He responded to a few messages, offering what guidance he could, knowing that his words might help someone else find the strength to speak up about injustice they'd witnessed. Then he set the phone aside and sat in the quiet of his home, listening to Luna purr and Ava's soft breathing from her bedroom, and the ordinary sounds of a life that had been destroyed and rebuilt into something stronger than before. The journey from that rainy night to this peaceful evening had been brutal and transforming. Ethan had lost almost everything and discovered what remained when everything else was stripped away. His integrity, his love for his daughter, his belief that doing right mattered even when it cost you dearly. Those were the things that couldn't be taken. Those were the foundations you built on when you were starting over from nothing. The city outside his window continued its restless motion, full of people struggling and surviving and occasionally winning battles against indifference. Ethan was one of them now. Not a hero, not a martyr, just someone who'd refused to stay silent and had somehow, impossibly, survived the consequences of that refusal. He'd learned that courage wasn't the absence of fear, but action despite it. That justice was possible, but not guaranteed, earned through persistence and luck in equal measure. That the system could be changed, but only by people brave enough to demand better, to risk everything for principles that seemed naive until they proved essential. And he'd learned that sometimes, when you lost everything, you discovered what truly mattered. Not the job or the apartment or the comfortable stability you'd built, but the relationships you protected and the integrity you maintained and the example you set for people who were watching to see if standing up for what was right was worth the cost. For Ava, growing up watching her father fight back from devastation with honesty as his only weapon, the answer was clear. Integrity mattered. Truth mattered. Treating people with dignity mattered more than profit or power or convenience. Those were the lessons that would shape her life, passed down from a father who'd learned them the hardest way possible. As spring settled over Seattle with its promise of renewal, Ethan Brooks sat in his modest apartment with his daughter and their rescue cat, surrounded by the pieces of a life rebuilt from ruins. It wasn't the life he'd planned, but it was good, and it was real, and it was his. And that, after everything, was more than enough. It was victory, hard-won and precious, earned through refusal to compromise the parts of himself that mattered most. The rain would come again. It always did in Seattle. But Ethan had learned that you could survive the storms, that you could rebuild from wreckage, that choosing integrity over comfort was difficult and worthwhile. And sometimes, if you were lucky and persistent and blessed with people who cared enough to stand beside you, rewarded in ways you couldn't have imagined when you were sitting in that car with nothing but your daughter's trust and your own stubborn belief that truth still mattered. He'd been right to believe. And the life he'd built from that belief was proof that sometimes, against all odds and expectations, doing the right thing was enough. Not because it was easy or guaranteed or safe, but because it was right. And right in the end was the only foundation that lasted.